while the other princes had retreated to their respective kingdom corners. As the third trial grounds were prepared, Ryu obviously did no such thing. Instead, he quietly meditated near the edge of the arena, once more increasing his mental realm to its peak state. He was very close to accomplishing his goals here. The first trap had already been laid. Now, all that remained for him to do was win. He didn't care how many odds were stacked up against him, nor did he care about the killing intent-filled gazes that stared daggers toward him. If they believed that this was enough to shake the heir of the Tatsuya clan, they were sorely mistaken. The bottom of the battle arena began to slowly split apart. It was a grand display. The image of several hundred meters worth of land giving way astonished the crowd that very rarely saw such displays. This definitely wasn't something that could be seen in the lower planes, and was the product of years of preparation, all for this day. Soon, a small cityscape raised up from below. It was surrounded by a ring of forest which was separated from the small-scale city by tall, 10-meter-high walls with a thickness of at least 5 meters. From a cursory glance, this battlefield looked like a replica of the Four Kingdoms, taking elements from each. The ring of forest was taken from Tor Kingdom, while the city structure was a replica of Opus Kingdom. Finally, the palace was identical in appearance to Viri Kingdom's Viri Palace, and the walls were the brainchild of Lantes Kingdom. Overall, the small-scale replica was just over 1 kilometer in diameter. The ring of forest took up half of this scale, while the city made up its core. There were 4 starting points the attackers could choose from, corresponding to the 4 cardinal directions. The reason for this was obvious after realizing that the tall walls had 4 points of entry. Attackers could either choose to concentrate their forces or split them apart, while the defenders would have no idea which of these options they would choose. Not long afterward, Ryu was escorted to the city palace, which would obviously act as his own starting point. It was clear by this point that, although the attacking roles were relatively balanced, there was a severe disadvantage to the defenders. What were 10-meter-tall walls in the face of chi refinement experts? Even though they couldn't fly, there were various methods available to them to circumvent these measures. Is he really planning on doing this alone? No one knew who asked this question first, but the murmur gained momentum and eventually became a wave over the crowd. They couldn't understand what Ryu was thinking. Had he really not cultivated any backers for himself in his lifetime? Even if he was the youngest prince here, wasn't that a bit too pitiful? Ryu accepted the kingdom core. As expected, the core was massive, spanning over 15 meters in every direction. In addition, it was incredibly heavy, weighing almost 50,000 jin, a weight that was well outside the output Ryu's body could handle. Other than this, the core was made of breaking ore. It was known for its incredible density and absurd fragility. Its chemical structure was such that even a decently powerful teenage mortal could shatter it into pieces as long as they had striking power of about 100 jins. Because of this, breaking ore was looked down upon by almost everyone who would want such an obnoxiously heavy material that could break apart so easily. However, when Ryu saw this breaking ore, sensing it with his foggy spiritual sense, he smiled brightly. He ran his hand over its transparent exterior. After confirming his thoughts, he couldn't help but feel happy. Breaking ore was an odd material. In its current state, it would be a beautiful crystalline if it wasn't for the fact the flecks of black and gray impurities pervaded its body. As things stood, it really was only useful to be used in such a trial. It was difficult to move without breaking, yet it was heavy beyond belief. So why was Ryu happy? Because he knew well what this material could become if refined properly. After all, it was labeled as an ore for a reason. Neutron star core was both the densest and hardest material in the world. Ryu's chaotic silk meridians ranked 3rd on the list of hardest materials in the world. Although breaking ore couldn't stand up to these world-defying materials, refined breaking ore, or breaking crystal, was ranked 22nd on the list of hardest materials. This wasn't all either. If it was just about being the hardness, Ryu would hardly blink an eye. Hardness was great, but it was only valuable it had other properties. For example, chaotic silk was also incredibly light, while neutron star core was incredibly dense. As for breaking crystal, it ranked top 3 among the most flexible materials in the world, and top 10 in chi flow. This flexibility index wasn't a simple matter of being able to bend. It also calculated the ability of a material to come back to its original form, even after being deformed. This was a measure of elasticity. This sort of ability was invaluable in weapons. Not only would it mitigate the striking power of an opponent, it would also allow smoother attack patterns and an added unpredictable in said patterns. In addition, a material chi flow index decided how smoothly it could accommodate its owner's kai. Those that ranked so highly had a high threshold for the amount of kai it could withstand. Ryu could imagine great things for this material. If he used it as the material for his weapon's pole arms, he'd never have to worry about his weapons snapping under the weight of his strikes. However, this was only the tip of the iceberg. Just how amazing would breaking crystal be if refined into a long bow? Not only would its innate density make it capable of withstanding Ryu's use of the natural order sex heirloom, it would be outstanding as a bow even without it. That said, Ryu knew he was getting ahead of himself. While the polearm and body of a bow were important, the blade and respective bowstring was just important. He would definitely have to take his time to find material worthy of being paired with this breaking crystal. He would also need to find a blacksmith with the skill to refine this ore properly, who would have known that the mortal plane would have such a treasure. This ore would fetch a great price even on the former shrine plane, and it was likely that this wasn't the only breaking ore they prepared for this trial. After all, didn't they expect Ryu to lose? That would mean that they expected his breaking ore to be shattered. Although the breaking ore was currently massive, after being refined, Ryu would be lucky to receive even a cubic foot out of this 15 cubic meter block. He'd definitely pillage these wasted resources. Since they wanted to kill him, why not take advantage of them? The crowd couldn't help but wonder what Ryu was smiling about. Of all the emotions they thought they'd see, distress, anxiousness, worry they expected happiness the least. Due to the fact the attackers were allowed to see how Ryu planned out his defenses, the crowd was obviously able to do so as well. This aside, since the immortal role wasn't allowed to see exactly where the core was hidden, the princes wouldn't be able to see these images until after they chose their role. This was another reason why they were sent back to their respective corners. Ryu took a single leap upward. The core was taller than even the city walls, yet Ryu cleared the distance with ease, leisurely sitting atop the core with a relaxed expression. Obviously, with his control over the northern heavenly wind, this and similar feats for him were quite easy. Ready? Ryu's voice projected outward, stunning those spectating once more. Yana, who had been hoping all this time that Ryu had some trick he had yet to bring out, suddenly felt her world plunge into darkness. How could anyone expect Ryu to succeed when he was alone? In just a few minutes, he would be facing hundreds of opponents. At the very least, shouldn't he try to move the core into the forest? Give himself some extra room to maneuver. Although the core weighed an obscene amount, it was still in the shape of a ball. However, many also understood Ryu's actions as well. Wasn't it already hopeless? Why put in so much effort? Plus, attempting to move such a heavy and fragile object alone was practically asking for trouble. Wouldn't it be too embarrassing if Ryu's core shattered before the trial even began? This, Headmaster Leopold felt uncomfortable, but in the end he sighed. What more could Ryu do at this point? Maybe his approach was already the best. First, Prince Tor, choose your attacking role. Amori's eyes flashed. Immortal. He spoke without hesitation. Anyone who understood him knew exactly why he chose this role. With 20 chi refinement experts at his disposal, who cared about a mere 3-hour difference. Even more importantly, choosing Immortal now basically locked the other princes into this role as well, just in case he failed. This put Opus Kingdom at a major disadvantage, because everyone knew they only had 10 chi refinement experts in total. In addition, there weren't many princes other than him who could bring out this number of experts. Aside from the Dragon Corps and Wydrek's personal troops, the other princes would be hard-pressed. Knowing this, why would Amory pick the mortal role that restricted him to 5 chi refinement experts? In the next moments, the Dragon Corps began to gather, each sitting upon a royal war horse. This time around, Amory didn't call out a specific squadron or division. He directly amassed his entire force, 300 men, 20 of whom were of the chi refinement realm, 80 who were pulse-opening realm experts, and 200 who were within the awakening realm. This was a frightening lineup that could shake even a kingdom's elites to their core. Their red armor shone a bloody crimson light under the high sun, even as their battle-intent soared. The crowds of people couldn't help but feel stifled. They were just normal mortals. How often could they see such a line-up? Amory didn't position his army in any sort of clever fashion. They all stood in a perfect formation, split into 3 groups of 100 that were further divided into 10 groups of 10. Without fail, they sat as straight as javelins, looking forward toward the northern gate and awaiting Amory's command. Not long after, Amory strode forward on a war horse matted in red fur. It was 10% larger than the finest breeds one could imagine, its body seemingly carved from precious stone. Amory had ditched his scholarly robes for a beautiful set of red gold armor, a bloody sword attached to his hip. When he saw that Ryu hadn't even bothered to close the gates after he was escorted in, his eyes narrowed. But he had long since regained his composure. He had been waiting almost 2 years for this day. It was this that would decide whether or not the Tor clan fell. If others heard Amory's thoughts, they would be confused beyond belief. How could these events decide something like that? However, Amory knew better. Ryu would definitely not come here for something as petty as proving he was their betters. To Ryu, even the skies above his head were too low. Did he really have to come here to show off? Anyone who thought such a thing didn't understand Ryu at all. Ryu wanted to find his wife. He wanted to see his parents and grandparents again. He wanted to slaughter those who dared lay their hands upon the Tatsuya clan and his shrine plane. Did he care for the petty squabbles of this higher mortal plane? He had said it once before. If it wasn't for Granny Miriam's death, he wouldn't have even bothered to seek revenge for him. This looming worry lingered at the back of Amory's mind. No matter how much he shook it off, he couldn't ignore the feeling that not only had Ryu's accomplished much of his purpose already, if he was allowed to take the final step, the Tor clan was finished. All of Amory's nerves were screaming at him with everything they had. He couldn't allow Ryu to win. Charge! Amory roared when his emotions reached their peak. Everything he was feeling bellowed out from his chest, rumbling through the arena with a fiery passion. The Dragon Corps was awoken. They could feel the conviction and unbridled purpose behind their commander's voice. Their blood boiled, roaring in response. The very arena below their feet shook as they set off behind Amory's warhorse, charging directly toward the central palace. At that moment, Ryu sat quietly. He could feel the rumbling of the ground, the emotions of his elder brother, even the coursing blood of his enemies. But he remained calm, his hands gliding over the smooth surface of the breaking ore as the rumbling grew louder. The crowd watched with bated breath as Amory closed the distance. 500 meters, 400 meters, 300 meters, 200 meters, 100 meters. Ryu was within Amory's field of vision. In the next moment, he raised his arm, causing 50 archers to knock their bows. Despite the speed of their warhorses, they seemed completely unaffected. Spectators watched in shock. If Amory really did this, wouldn't Ryu die? Would this be the first death of these coronation games? As though oblivious to their thoughts, Amory's arm fell. 50 arrows blotted out the skies, descending Ryu into an endless night. The arrows were let loose from almost 150 meters away, yet they locked onto Ryu perfectly. Considering a normal common-grade bow could only be used at a distance of 30 to 40 meters, with only some of the better ones being accurate to about 70 meters, it could be understood just how amazing the bowmen of the Dragon Corps were. Not only did their weapons have such an outrageous advantage, They were actually skilled enough and powerful enough to use them. Ryu stood slowly. About the only good thing about his enemies being able to launch such ranged assaults was that they gave Ryu plenty of time to prepare. For Ryu, the few seconds the arrows spent in the air were more than enough. In truth, the foggy spiritual sense Ryu had access to now didn't have such an exaggerated range. The only reason he knew the arrows had launched into the air was because of their sound. It wasn't until they entered his 20 or so meter range that their faint outlines appeared in his mind. In that moment, Ryu willed his glaive to appear from his spatial ring, standing atop the rounded surface of the core as though it was no different from flat ground. Ryu took a deep breath. Air surged toward him, filling his body to the brim. Deeper? He spoke softly, his state of meditation sinking with every passing moment. Soon, Ryu settled into the breath of earth. What once was a mere 20-meter range pushed outward, reaching 30. Ryu rotated his wrist, twirling the glaive in his hand with a trained expertise. Time slowed to a crawl. It was almost as though Ryu's heart only beat once every 10 seconds. The chests of those watching seized. This move by Amori was truly sinister. Launching so many arrows wouldn't only take Ryu's life, it was guaranteed that the breaking ore would shatter soon after. Even if Ryu managed to survive, he would lose without a doubt. How could a single person protect such a large object? Ryu looked no different than an ant before the breaking ore. While time had slowed for Ryu in an almost tangible sense, for those spectating, they experienced a similar reality, but for far different reasons. Even those of other kingdoms felt it was a pity for such a genius to fall in this way. Just what was the Tor clan thinking? Suddenly, Ryu stepped forward, his stance incredibly light. His glaive shot forward toward the first arrow. Many thought that Ryu was attempting to break all of the arrows he faced, but how could that be possible? Sending out 50 strikes in what amounted to a split second was impossible for anyone below the peak spiritual severing realm. Others believed that Ryu only wanted to protect his own life. With his skill, as long as he gave up on the breaking ore and focused on protecting a half-meter radius around himself, he would undoubtedly survive. Of those who thought this way, Patriarch Cedar was among them. He couldn't help but be enraged by his grandson's tactics. Wasn't this simply giving Ryu a path to live? However, Amori never thought this way. He believed that even with the high evaluation his grandfather had given Ryu, it was still too low. Not only would Ryu survive this attack, the breaking ore be unscathed. It was at that moment that something magical occurred. Ryu's movements became incomparably beautiful. It was only now those watching understood the allure of minimalism. Ryu had a perfect grasp of this. His glaive surged forward, glancing along the tip of the arrow and following along its body. Just like that, the arrow was redirected, flying harmlessly to the side, unable to harm Ryu or his breaking ore. This simple movement was none other than skim. Skim was considered a half parry. Instead of blowing an opponent back for an explosive counter, it instead made use of an opponent's leverage against them. Using their weapon, an expert who executed skim could redirect the attack they were facing by sliding their blade along the length of their opponent's weapon. In truth, this defensive stance was looked down upon by polearm wielders. This was because it was most effective for closing the distance between two enemies. But this was obviously something those with medium-range weapons wouldn't like. The number of actions a polearm wielder could take in close range was highly limited. As a result, skim and advanced techniques related to it were usually left to dagger wielders and maybe the occasional short sword expert. However, who would have thought the technique that so many polearm experts looked down upon could be used in such a way? It was absolutely mesmerizing. Nothing short of art, the dance of an expert. Those who were spectating were correct. Ryu couldn't send out 50 strikes in a split second. That realm was too far from him now. Even if he applied the abilities of his northern heavenly wind to his weapon, Ryu believed he could only send out 12 to 15 strikes in a single second. However, for Ryu, just 10 strikes was enough. Ryu's glaive snaked forward, knocking arrows off their path. But his actions weren't so simple. For every time he used skim, each arrow that slid off his blade wreaked havoc. With every deflection, a single arrow would inexplicably collide along the paths of 3 or 4 others. Ryu's wrists twisted at unbelievable angles, resisting striking power that amounted to more than 500 jin each time. If it wasn't for his bone structure giving him ridiculous flexibility, his bones would have shattered, leaving him crippled for several weeks. However, in thanks to his mother, Ryu could bring out his full strength even while tilting his body in ways that seemingly had no leverage at all. A silence fell over the battle arena as the final arrow was avoided by Ryu with a simple tilt of his head. No one could imagine the level of calculation and reflexes it would take to replicate Ryu's feat. Not even a single scratch could be seen on his breaking oar. Yet he stood amid a cemetery of broken arrows. The only person who seemed completely unsurprised was Amori. However, even he couldn't have predicted what happened next. I'm crawling at a snail's pace toward this dream of dual polearm wielding. Ryu sighed, but there are some very clear advantages. While my striking power is far less, my degrees of freedom and striking speed is overwhelmingly faster. I guess this isn't the proper place to test this out. I'll stop playing around. In the next moment, the 50,000 jin breaking oar vanished from thin air. Amori was so shocked by what he saw that he lost control of his reins for a moment. If it wasn't for his quick reaction time, not only would he have fallen from his horse, he would have been trampled by his own dragon core. What a terrible death that would have been. It wasn't just Amori. Even the esteemed headmaster Leopold had an incredulous expression on his face. How could he ever have thought that something like this would happen? Everyone was aware that Ryu had a spatial ring. After all, if he didn't, just where was he pulling his weapons from? The reason headmaster Leopold ignored this was because, as a well-learned man, he was aware of how rare spatial rings were. In addition, he also knew that the larger their inner spaces were, the vastly more expensive and unreachable they would be as well. The truth was that Headmaster Leopold had already thought of this sort of exploit. In order to make sure that the kingdoms with sects still backing them couldn't borrow spatial rings in order to put Quan and Kalman at even more of a disadvantage, he requested that the breaking oar be constructed to an abnormally large size. If it wasn't for his odd yet specific instructions, who would go through the hassle of mining such a fragile ore to the size of 15 cubic meters. According to what Leopold knew, the best spatial rings on this higher mortal plane had about 10 cubic meters of space. Never in his wildest dreams did think Ryu's own was overshadow them to this extent. Headmaster Leopold could only helplessly sigh. What could he do? It wasn't as though he could suddenly change the rules midway. Plus, Ryu was already at a disadvantage, facing hundreds alone. How silly would everyone look complaining about something like this? Wasn't Ryu right before you now? Then catch him. Of course, Ryu had thought of this method long ago. His spatial ring wasn't created by the standards of the higher mortal plane. It was a present Granny Miriam's younger sister sent her for her birthday a few decades ago. Knowing how much Miriam loved to travel and care for the sick, her younger sister spent a lot of money getting her elder sister this ring. Even by the pedestal plane standard, it was large, sitting with just over 100 cubic meters, let alone just one breaking oar. Ryu could fit a dozen and still have about 50% of the space remaining. Just as Amori was stabilizing his horse, he suddenly caught the faint image of a shadow out of the corner of his eye. Before he could react, the front legs of his warhorse were sliced in half. He hadn't even tumbled forward, yet by the time Ryu passed him by, not bothering with his presence, the Dragon Corps couldn't believe Ryu's speed. He had just been just over 100 meters away, yet a few seconds of distraction already had him upon them. It took him no more than a single attack for their organized formation to be thrown into disarray. Amori tumbled through the wide cobbled street, allowing him momentum to roll him forward before springing upward. Even with his disheveled appearance, order after order began tumbling out from his lips. Several squads at the front acted as a buffer, while those in the back organized themselves according to Amori's orders. No matter how heaven-defying Ryu was, he was too arrogant. Maybe if he used this speed of his to run into the forest, they would sigh in despair. But he hadn't done that. He actually ran right into them. He was most definitely playing into their hands. What this dragon core didn't know was that, while Ryu danced among them, the thoughts they aimed toward him were the same thoughts he had about them. To Ryu, it was completely foolish for Amori to charge straight at him. He should have cast a net, closing off Ryu's options. But as things stood now, Ryu had two measures he could take. Numbers meant absolutely nothing to Ryu. Amori had 20 chi refinement experts, but he actually restricted them with military rules. How could they bring out their strengths like this? When wars on the immortal planes were fought, they weren't done in this way. Immortals were often left to their own devices, allowing them to wreak havoc as they saw fit. In Ryu's opinion, this wasn't a good approach either. Control and order were all important when fighting in such a large group, but too much restriction was a bad thing as well. Due to their formation restrictions, the chi refinement experts could only watch as Ryu incapacitated their allies right before their eyes. Although none of them died, their falls from their high horses broke several bones. They simply weren't as lucky as Amori. While the first prince had been a lone rider at the front, when they fell, they were amidst several other men and horses. Those who fell suffered greatly. What broke Amori's heart the most wasn't even the injuries of his men. Every time another war horse gave off a pained cry before becoming forever crippled, he felt knives being stabbed into his heart. Each one of these war horses were carefully bred for over 15 years. He had poured at least 10,000 gold into even the youngest. As for his own war horse, even 100,000 gold was a conservative estimate. With every flash of Ryu's glaive, another war horse fell. By the time Amori finished rattling off his commands just 20 seconds later, almost 30 war horses and warriors were incapacitated. 10% of his dragon core gone just like that. Ryu smiled as the dragon core organized itself. He suddenly found his pathways cut off. After learning from his mistakes, Amori had the chi refinement experts take the helm. Everyone else was simply cannon fodder to Ryu. The 20 chi refinement experts surged forward from all sides, the strongest of them being of the middle chi refinement stage. Ryu's body flickered and swayed, narrowly dodging spear after spear. Unfortunately for Amori once more, he had made another mistake. Ryu was inexperienced in combat. Even after spending 8 months training against beasts, that was the true extent of his knowledge. He had never fought another human, nor had he ever taken a life. Yet Amori did him the greatest service by outfitting his warriors with the weapon he was most familiar with. What a great gift this was! As time passed, Ryu's movements became more fluid. He began to understand that, although beasts had intelligence, humans were still that small notch above. By now, the remaining dragon core had completely encircled Ryu. At Amori's behest, 50 archers had once more taken aim, but Ryu saw this as a cheap trick. Did Amori really expect him to believe that they would shoot at their own allies? This time, unfortunately for Ryu, that was exactly what they did. Seeing 50 archers taking aim and letting loose their arrows, the crowd suddenly felt that their hearts had taken too much punishment in the past 2 days. Not only was this move especially cruel, it was nigh impossible to dodge. As things stood now, Ryu only had about a 3 meters radius of movement space around him. Even this much was in part a product of his expert use of his glaive, ensuring that his opponents didn't get too close, and in part due to his enemies also using medium-ranged weapons. Ryu's brows furrowed. If he took the time to deal with these arrows, the chi refinement experts definitely wouldn't take this lying down. Although Ryu didn't believe restricting such experts in this way was the best use of their abilities, he had to admit that the fact they were bound by military law essentially guaranteed that they would dive headfirst into this sort of suicidal action. Even if it meant taking several arrows head-on, they would continue to charge forward. At this moment, Ryu regretted not learning any defensive techniques. He had told himself to do so multiple times, but the natural order sect simply didn't have anything that was suitable for him. All such defensive techniques, they had were crude ones that involved hardening the skin and bones. But this was completely incompatible with Ryu's bone structure. If he tried to forcibly learn these techniques, he would be lowering his own potential. Ryu's breathing steadied, the world around him slowing once more as he entered an even deeper state. Breath of heaven. Ryu himself knew that although his time limit for breath of earth had increased to just over a half an hour, his breath of heaven would only last him a few seconds, because he had already used breath of earth for upwards of 10 minutes already. This time would be even shorter, not to mention the fact that it would definitely drain him of his spiritual chi. The consequences of such a thing can be imagined. Of them, the most terrible cost would be the impact to his spiritual sense. After this, it would be a toss-up as to whether he would be able to use it at all. Good. This is the sort of pressure I need. If I can't even defeat these people, what right do I have to defeat an enemy my parents couldn't? In the distance, the frail-hearted Yana felt that her world was collapsing. Finally, unable to handle it anymore, a small, delicate shout left her lips as she fainted into her grandfather's arms. Seeing the state of his granddaughter, the old general felt his heart constrict. He remembered all those years ago, him looking down upon Ryu. As a military man, what he praised the most wasn't intelligence, but strength of character and power. When he first met Ryu, all he saw was an arrogant and scrawny little boy that knew nothing of the world. In the army, arrogance is something you earn by putting your life on the line. There was nothing more important than seniority and hierarchy. So when the old general saw Ryu's attitude, he immediately felt disdain. What had this little boy done to earn the right to carry such an aura? Him and his brothers shed blood and tears for the right to hold their heads high. He hadn't done a single thing. This attitude of the old general's didn't begin to change until he saw Ryu withstand a vicious beating, with uttering so much as a word. It was at that moment that he felt that maybe his views were partially flawed. Although Ryu had yet to earn his stripes on the battlefield, he had earned his arrogance in another way. Seeing Ryu's actions here, the old general felt that his second conclusion was correct. "Huh?" A mighty call left Ryu's lips. His white hair flowed widely, not a single speck of dust to be found amidst their flawless strands. In that moment, a second glaive appeared in Ryu's hand. His arms became akin to reapers of death. With every step he took, and with every strike he sent, a shower of blood would rain. Dual-wielding glaives. Those experts of the crowd felt like they had been dropped into a fantasy. Which of them had ever seen something like this? They couldn't decide whether what they were witnessing was ridiculous or ingenious. But what they did know was that they felt a certain trembling take root in their hearts. It felt as though Ryu was so close, yet so far to something special. In truth, they could tell that his movements weren't as fluid as when he focused on a single weapon. Those who were sharper realized that Ryu definitely couldn't maintain this sort of state for an extended period of time. It was no wonder he hadn't brought out this trump card until now. Ryu's glaives flickered with a faint kai, but it was wholly lacking in comparison to when he focused his everything on one weapon. If he had to put a label on his current state, if his properly handling his glaive had entered the small success realm, then as of now, he couldn't even be considered to be within the entry realm. He was in some inferior state that didn't have the right to have a moniker of its own. Still, the trade-off in skill and fluidity was made up for by the fact there were two weapons. Ryu could suddenly deal with attacks from all 360 degrees. The arrows that closed in on Ryu never so much as touched a hair on his head. With a thought, he executed skim repeatedly. With every action, another arrow not only narrowly shot by him, but were redirected toward warriors behind him. Ryu was actually using attacks levied toward him to deal with the elites of the Dragon Corps. Their dreams of sacrificing themselves to get close to Ryu went up in smoke. As volley after volley of arrows were let loose, the chi refinement experts only became more injured. Even with their armor and cultivation, there was only so much punishment they could take. Still, Ryu was nearing his limit as well. He understood now that the hurdle he faced wasn't just about finding a method to infuse the prowess of a two-handed weapon into one. He also had to enter a strong enough mental realm to split his mind two ways. If he couldn't do this, he would never succeed. Amori could tell that Ryu was nearing his limit. This was why he hadn't ordered his warriors to stop despite the situation. He could only steal his heart, but it was at that moment that he felt that something was off. He couldn't understand where this uneasy feeling was coming until it was already too late. Shit. Squadrons 5 and 6 close off points to the east and west. Ryu smiled lightly. His body suddenly became as light as a feather, shooting through a gap he created toward the east. All the time he spent redirecting arrows wasn't wasted. Instead, he slowly concentrated his fire on 2 points, just in case Amori found one. He couldn't help but be slightly impressed that Amori actually found both. But it was too late. Ryu shot through, disappearing amid the city buildings. The trial suddenly became of cat and mouse. In his peak state, this sort of thing would be easy for Ryu. Unfortunately, as things stood now, he was completely handicapped. His foggy spiritual sense, which had once had a 20-meter or so range, fell to the point where it stretched out barely an inch from himself. At the same time, he was completely exhausted. His muscles were screaming, and his lungs felt as though he had inhaled hot coals. It wasn't long before the crowd's attention was trained on the image of Ryu gasping for breath. He sat on the abandoned top floor of an antique shop, trying to gather himself. Of course, Ryu put this sort of pressure on himself on purpose. Since much of his goal here had been accomplished, he saw this trial as nothing more than a training opportunity. Still, even though he expected dual wielding would be difficult, he never guessed it would put so much strain on him. The longer a weapon was, the more difficult the act of controlling it became. It was for exactly this reason that polearms were two-handed weapons. Only with 2 hands could you have the stability and power that was needed to make proper use of them. Take, for example, the spear. A youth training in this path would spend years honing their accuracy, trying their best to gain perfect control of the tip of their weapon. A warrior who reached an almost unconscious level in the spear would be capable of piercing the same point continuously with barely a millimeter of error between strikes. Now imagine accomplishing the same feat with only a single hand. Without the stability provided by a second hand, one needed to activate all of their focus in order to match that level of control. Then consider for a moment that they would need that level of focus not just once over, but twice. Ryu understood this point vaguely. This was why even during his training in the Beast Mountains, he avoided dual wielding, instead opting to focus on one hand at a time to hone this skill. Yet, even with all of that preparation and the support of Breath of Heaven, he barely lasted a few seconds before his stamina gave out. To make matters worse, his movements were clumsy and awkward, nothing like he imagined it would be like. Even with all of this said, how Ryu fared would have been even more embarrassing had it not been for the Cunning Clan martial form. This martial form focused on controlled speed and explosiveness. To reach that end, all of its forms emphasized small muscles groups that were often neglected. These small muscle groups acted as the hundreds of tiny stabilizers Ryu needed to control a two-handed weapon with one. If Ryu hadn't trained in this martial form, not only would his attempt have ended in disaster, he likely would have crippled himself for a time. It seems I'm still not ready. Ryu took deep breaths, circulating the Ice Phoenix martial form to soothe his aching muscles. I need more flexibility and stability. It seems I'll have to put even more effort into my martial forms. The soft sounds of footsteps caused Ryu's lips to curl into a slight sneer that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. There was no way Amori could have found him on his own in such a short period of time. The only explanation is that someone used the visual jade that was monitoring him to guess his location before sending a chi line message to Amori. Unfortunately, Headmaster Leopold had no cultivation to speak of, so it was impossible for him to monitor this. Ryu's expression turned cold once more. He had only recovered to about 5% of his peak, But that was more than enough. Sending his glaive into his spatial ring, he sprang up, shattering a window to his left and leaping atop its sill. His hand snaked forward, snagging two relatively large pieces of glass before pushing off. He became a shadow in the skies, making it halfway to an adjacent building before the Dragon Core warriors below even registered the sound of breaking glass. "He's over there," a squad captain roared. He had been placed here precisely to watch out for Ryu's escape in this fashion, so he was already well prepared. With a thought, his archers took aim, firing a volley toward Ryu's figure. Ryu couldn't see what was happening clearly. His senses had been dulled and his eyes were closed. But he still had his comprehension of gliding cloud steps. He immediately felt the shift in the wind. Although it was far more difficult since arrows were designed to agitate air as minutely as possible, Ryu had focused his everything on their existence. His body twisted, but this time, his outcome wasn't as elegant as all those times before. While the third-order beast leather Ryu wore had decent defense, it was also quite heavy. With Ryu's muscles aching as they were, it was difficult to ignore its stiffness. The black leather sheared apart, nipping Ryu in the arm and both thighs. One arrow even managed to scrape along his rib cage, taking with it a trail of blood and flesh. However, Ryu survived. The pressure he felt made his blood boil, a faint excitement overwhelming him. It was far too easy before, but this feeling made it worth it. How long had he spent as a cripple, as a man without any power to speak of? This was true freedom, the freedom to grasp everything with your own hands, your own power. Ryu spun in the air, the two glass shards he had taken launching outward. One sped toward squad captain's voice, and another headed toward the marksman who tore a wound through his ribcage. Ryu's strength hadn't recovered enough to use his true weapons, but he definitely had enough to make use of these two pieces of glass. He didn't have the luxury of finding out how his attack ended. In the next instant, he had rolled onto the opposite building's roof, springing upward and disappearing in a flash. Ryu faintly heard the agonizing screams of two men. The crowd could only take in a sharp, cold breath, watching as the glass shards hit their mark. Both men lost an eye. In fact, they would have died had the glass been made of more resistant material. The beautiful scene of Ryu escaping ambush after ambush awed the crowd. Over time, some more astute individuals began to see just how odd it was that Ryu was found so easily every time. They didn't know how the cheating was occurring, but they definitely knew that it was happening. Unfortunately for Amori and the Dragon Core, none of it mattered. The 2-hour period ended without them ever catching Ryu. The crowd watched in awe as Ryu entered skirmish after skirmish. He always seemed to escape by the skin of teeth, constantly dancing across the blade of death. If one looked closely, you could see a small smile on his cold face, one even he had lost the ability to hide. After a while, it became clear that Ryu was treating this like a game. He had many opportunities to leave the city and enter the forest, a place that would be far harder if not impossible to pinpoint his location in, even while cheating, but he never did. Aside from brief 5-minute breaks he had every so often, he kept pushing his body toward its upper limit. By the time the 2-hour time limit had approached and been passed, a sort of undefeatable legend had been created. Even Yana, who had finally awoken from her unconscious state, watched with a clear glitter in her eye, happiness swelling within her young maiden heart. In the end, a loud chime ended the round. Clearing his throat, Headmaster Leopold spoke. "The first round has come to a close. Please cease all action. Fourth Prince Tor will be allowed a 30-minute break before he must begin preparing his defenses for the second round." At this moment, another throat was cleared. However, this time, it was very clearly not Leopold's own. While Leopold had to rely on various projection mechanisms to allow all those in attendance to hear him, the person who spoke this time relied on nothing else but their own cultivation. "It can't be that you plan to allow things to continue like this, right, old Leopold?" The crowd frowned. Old Leopold wasn't a title filled with any sort of respect. In fact, for someone who had prestige as high as the headmaster, It bordered on disrespect. However, when those spectating saw that it was Patriarch Cedar who spoke, they refrained from speaking. Of the non-royal families, the Cedar clan was most definitely the greatest. The pillar families of the various kingdoms couldn't even compare. In fact, some believed that if the Cedar clan struck out in full force, they could take on an entire kingdom themselves, as long as that kingdom wasn't Tor kingdom. That is, considering even Ryu's maternal grandfather was a chi refinement expert before he was crippled by King Tor's death guard. It wasn't a surprise that Patriarch Cedar was one as well. In fact, not only was he one, from the projection of his voice, he wasn't any weaker than the peak chi refinement realm. To think a member of King Tor's own generation was actually more powerful than he was. This revelation made King Tor's eyes narrowed, but he quickly feigned indifference. He too would be of the peak chi refinement realm if it hadn't been for the heart demon that was his own son affecting him so much. Still, this didn't answer a very important question. Just how did Patriarch Cedar match the cultivation speed of a man with an Earth-grade skeletal structure? If it wasn't for the matters of today raging so far out of control, Patriarch Cedar would have rather keep his prowess a secret. But it was too inappropriate for King Tor to speak himself. However, him taking the role and concerned, senile old man could work to his advantage now. "I'm not sure what you mean," Headmaster Leopold replied calmly. "You, yourself, claimed that this trial had the purpose of testing a prince's ability to rule. How is the act of running around like a headless chicken for 2 hours prove the fourth prince can be king? How does being incapable of stopping a headless chicken with the help of 300 men and war horses prove the first prince can be king?" Ryu's cold voice cut through Patriarch Cedar's inquiry. This man was quite low-key. For Ryu, who spent much of his second life's childhood locked away, he of course knew even less than a normal individual would about Patriarch Cedar. However, that wouldn't stop him from sneering at him with disdain. "What a ridiculous argument. I never said that first Prince Tor was worthy of being king either." Patriarch Cedar continued unperturbed. "Oh, if that's the case, no one here is worthy of being king. Might as well conclude these coronation games here. It's not worth continuing," Ryu said calmly. Luckily, Ryu had no need to go all out to project his voice like Patriarch Cedar did. With the jade still hanging from his neck, it did all the work for him. "Ho ho, how confident," Patriarch Cedar chuckled. "Unfortunately, we must continue. Although this competition gauges who has the right to be king, it is, after all, designed by a man who's never been a king himself. There are bound to be flaws. Are you trying to say that the 4 kingdoms whose futures hang in the balance can't have a say-so in tweaking the rules here and there? Of course, I also am not a king. I'm simply raising my own questions. Whether the esteemed rulers of our higher mortal plane would like to action based on this old man's words or not is up to them." Ryu suddenly laughed. "What a clever old man you are. This little one truly has no way to rebut your shamelessness. I'm sure some more thick-faced kings would be willing to take you up on your offer, realizing their sons aren't my match. If that's the case, I'll happily oblige by any rule changes. After all, my influence is lacking. I can only take a step back and be bullied." Ryu's words caused Patriarch Cedar's visage to darken considerably. He had struck this verbal attack, believing that Ryu was just an arrogant youngster with a temper. If he had known that Ryu knew how to lay traps in his words and retreat when necessary, he would have never made this attempt. As expected, none of the 4 kings said anything after hearing Ryu's words. If they did, wouldn't they be admitting that they were thick-skinned and willing to bully a youth? In fact, King Tor actually stepped forward to grab some prestige for himself, giving an impassioned speech about how he treated all of his sons as equals, and that any king who dared to agree with Patriarch Cedar's words would be making an enemy out of him. Hearing his so-called father's words, Ryu almost felt like laughing into the skies. King Tor would have never made this move had it not been for the fact he wanted to remind Patriarch Cedar just who was king. In the end, Cedar's prowess reveal led to his downfall. King Tor suddenly wasn't sure if he wanted Amori to become king anymore. With every move you make, you only fall further into the pit I've dug for you. Ryu smiled lightly. I have no need for a break. Headmaster Leopold, begin the next round. Before the crowd could recover from their shock, Ryu easily swept Kalman and Wydrek aside. Kalman didn't even have 20 chi refinement experts to call upon, while Wydrek's warriors were only better equipped than the Dragon Corps, not better trained. Ryu danced on the blade's edge once more, grasping victory. Ryu stood tall, his chest heaving uncontrollably. By now, his leather robes were in tatters. He could only rip them from his body, tossing them to the side to reveal a body that seemed carved of white marble. His skin itself shone like the purest ice in existence, bereft of flaws. After 3 long rounds, Ryu's body still stood as tall as a javelin. Those of other kingdoms couldn't even bring themselves to hate this young man. They only felt that he was an untouchable existence, a star far above their heads, a moon too resplendent to observe directly. Before Ryu stood what remained of Wydrek's golden-armored warriors. With the help of his appointed commander, Wydrek's tactics were far more refined than Amori's approach. He cast a net across the city, slowly cutting off Ryu's avenues of escape until he became a mouse caught in a trap. Even still, that wasn't enough. By the end of the 2-hour period, Ryu still stood tall. A sigh escaped his second brother's lips. Wydrek's lazy appearance faded slightly, replaced by a deep worry. Although this look quickly faded away, those who knew Wydrek could understand what he was feeling right now. Ryu wasn't the only one who had suffered at the hands of the Imperial censors. Wydrek's maternal clan had as well. Usually, with the old general's character, he would back his granddaughter in marrying whoever she so chose. However, an incident that occurred some decade plus ago made him realize that loyalty and staunchness wasn't rewarded in the way he believed. This left him disillusioned to the point where he cracked under the pressure, already preparing for the possibility of marrying his granddaughter off to the youth who grasped the most power. At the same time, the old general understood enough that these matters wouldn't just end with Ryu becoming crown prince. Even now, he believed that Ryu was too naive in coming here. Did he think that showing off his talents would be enough for everything to flip on its head? They had all been aware of just how talented Ryu was long ago, yet that changed nothing. So, what could this display possibly do? Old General Garrus felt that the only chance his clan stood was for Wydrek to become king. Only then could the Garrus clan wipe the humiliation they faced all those years ago. But reality was cruel. Ryu's resplendent light outshone that of all of his brothers. They simply weren't his match, even with how talented each of them was. Ryu took a step forward, helping Wydrek up from his fall. This sort of action stunned the second prince. He had been certain that Ryu hated them all. After all, through all the years Ryu suffered, Wydrek never raised a hand to help. Maybe this was because he had his own circumstances to fight through. But the reason would be irrelevant to a young boy with no tall tree to take shade under. Wydrek didn't know that Ryu hardly cared about the mistreatment he suffered, since Wydrek only attempted to capture him, despite the disadvantage that put him at. Ryu had no reason to be angry with him. The matters that occurred on this highest mortal plane had little to nothing to do with him. After he took revenge for Granny Miriam, he would disappear from their lives entirely. In truth, Ryu wasn't sure how to treat the matters of this life. Should he truly see Wydrek, Amori and Kaden as his brothers? Was Leilani his mother, King Tor his father? Even if he threw their connections to him to the back of his mind, it was the truth that they were responsible for his birth. Their blood once coursed through his veins. In the end, Ryu couldn't help but prioritize his first life. He simply felt no real connection to these people. Plus, the Tor bloodline no longer flowed through him. However, in light of those past connections, he would help those who were worth his help. The third round has come to a close. Fourth Prince Tor has the right to a 30-minute break before he must begin preparing his defenses. Crown Prince Silas, prepare yourself. No need, Ryu said faintly. Considering this was already the third time he had done this, the crowd wasn't shocked at all. However, they couldn't help but shake their heads. There was only so much a single man could take. Watching Ryu take out a needle and personally stitch up some of his larger wounds, many thought he was an absolute madman. Some began to feel that the Tor Kingdom was simply trying to assert their dominance. Maybe they had hidden Ryu all this time to take the higher mortal plane by storm. They could almost imagine a day where the Tor Kingdom united the entire higher mortal plane. When they thought back to how King Tor defended Ryu, they couldn't help but nod to themselves. But others were skeptical. The relationship between the Heir and Tor clans clearly wasn't very good. That was on display today. With that sort of inner strife, could they accomplish such a feat? Silas began to prepare his troops. Since Ryu immediately said he was prepared, the timer had already begun. Yet soon, 10 minutes passed without Silas having made any movements at all, even with the crowd being completely baffled. It wasn't until the 30th minute mark that the Viri Kingdom troops began to make their way forward. However, even as Silas was taking his time, he didn't notice that there was a slumbering beast trembling within Ryu. The events of that night played in his mind again and again. With the help of the origin flame, every breath, every faint laughter and chuckle, every snide comment, they all replayed in his mind. Silas and Atticus had both treated Granny Miriam's death as a sideshow. They giggled and chortled, as though her pleas and his tears were nothing more than fuel for their amusement. Ryu had never laid eyes on Silas before, but his mind had already drawn a picture. Slanted, lazy but snake-like eyes, thin, curled lips, the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to kill his own mother. Why had Ryu been so docile to now, not even killing a single person? It was to force Silas to lower his guard. By now, they all probably believed that despite his arrogance, he was completely green and hadn't tasted murder before. Although they were correct in a superficial respect, the truth was that Ryu was no saint. As Silas meticulously laid neck closed in around Ryu, a bloody, murderous intent suddenly shot into the skies. Years of repressed hatred and will for vengeance dyed the setting sun red. At that moment, Silas stood upon a silver armor-clad war horse, his mouth curled into a sneer as his snake-like eyes darted around lazily. He seemed to be thinking about something that had nothing to do with these coronation games at all. By the time he realized the rage aimed toward him, it would already be too late. Ryu's spiritual sense still hadn't recovered. Without sleeping, or utilizing a mental realm-tailored spiritual ingredient or pill, it was impossible to so easily recover depleted spiritual chi. However, he could still feel the minor trembling of the ground, something he knew could only be caused by charging war horses. "Grandpa, are you really still not going to send anyone to help him? At least make Wydrek lend his troops to Ryu." Yana was starting to grow frustrated at her lack of ability to do anything. She had spent the past 2 days pleading with her grandfather, but he had still chosen to do nothing. The old general bitterly chuckled. "Little Nunu, even if I did the things you asked of me, do you believe he would accept such help? This little boy is too arrogant." "Ryu is not arrogant, he's just very confident," Yana replied stubbornly. There was nothing the old general could do at this point but endure the adorable, enraged rantings of his granddaughter. Because her parents were no longer here with them, he had raised Yana himself, and maybe he spoiled her a bit too much. Truthfully, Yana was an obedient, well-mannered child. The old general really couldn't understand what had gotten into her. "Crown Prince, the net has been set. We're ready to move in on your command. No matter what he does, there's no escaping," an acting commander of the Viri Kingdom warriors reported to Silas. "But I humbly advise Crown Prince Viri to retreat further. This Ryu is too unpredictable." Silas smiled lightly for a moment. Thinking back, Ryu had never touched any of the princes. Even Amori, who he should have a bone-deep hatred for, he left completely alone. "I wonder, is there some sort of conspiracy behind this?" he mused. If the crowd could think of it, why couldn't the princes? Ryu's appearance and actions were simply too odd. It really did make one feel that the Tor clan was becoming far too bold. Before, the higher mortal plane was in complete balance due to their 4 kingdoms. But now, The Opes kingdom had been effectively crippled, considering the Cedar clan under the Tor clan's wing had the battle prowess of a kingdom itself. Sweeping through what remained of them wasn't an impossibility. The only issue was that memories from that night were too real for Silas. He didn't believe that Ryu's tears and Granny Miriam's death were all a ruse. He was simply too good at reading human emotions. Ignoring the commander's words, Silas kicked the side of his war horse, launching himself forward. He needed to appropriately probe Ryu. He needed to understand just what his purpose here was. Was he truly after revenge? If so, was that revenge really aimed toward the Tor clan? Or was all of this a thin veil, hiding the dagger the Tor clan pointed toward them all? A dagger that was Ryu himself. Ryu's killing intent boiled, simmering into a tangible heat. But he could feel that his body had grown incredibly stiff. Due to the time Silas made him wait, his adrenaline had cooled along with his muscles. Now he could suddenly feel every bit of strain he had inflicted upon himself. However, ignoring that stiffness, Ryu's body leaned forward. In the beginning, it seemed like he would fall, but in the next instant, he shot forward at blinding speeds. Not once had Ryu displayed the full abilities of his northern heavenly wind publicly. Until now, the eyes of the various elders constricted into pinholes. That speed. It was a hair's breadth away from the spiritual severing realm. That's impossible. Even after all of this, he was still holding back. The king of the Viri kingdom involuntarily stood abruptly. He knew exactly which direction Ryu was headed in. If he guessed correctly, Silas, get out of there now. A terrible premonition overcame him. Silas wasn't the only son he had had in his life, but each and everyone fell in one way or another. King Viri was under no delusions. He knew quite well it was Silas who killed his brothers off one by one, but none of that mattered. He was the sole heir of the Viri kingdom. He couldn't be allowed to die. The Chi line message tore through the air with an invisible swiftness, reaching Silas' ears just as he was no more than 100 meters from the city's central square and Ryu. Silas wasn't the type of individual to like taking orders from another, even if that person was his father or master. But that didn't mean he was a fool. If anything, he was the direct opposite. The moment he heard his father's words, his heart trembled slightly. His arms pulled back, the reins of his silver-armored steed pulling taut. The neighing of a displeased war horse resounded, but it still obediently came to a stop. The troops around Silas paused in confusion, but the commander sighed in relief. It really was too much for their prince to enter the front lines. Amori had done so because he couldn't afford to show weakness when facing Ryu. After all, they were brothers fighting for the same throne, but Silas had no such obligation. His meticulous planning would speak for itself and make up for his lack of presence. But who would have known that the moment he lowered his guard, the slightest bit that a shadow akin to a prowling feline would enter their sights? Due to the net Silas cast, there were only 5 Chi refinement experts with him. Yet of them, only the commander realized the sort of situation they were in. He was moving too fast for them to react. Crown Pry. Before the words could leave his lips fully, the shadow had jumped upward, perfectly timing the descent of the front hooves of Silas' war horse to kick the Viri kingdom's crown prince squarely in the chest. Silas' eyes widened from their usual narrowed slits. Unable to comprehend what was happening, he flew backward with the speed of an arrow, smashing through the outer and inner walls of a nearby storehouse. Blood spewed from Silas' lips. Looking downward, he found a dent the size of a foot in his chest plate. It wasn't deep enough to shatter his heart, but it was deep enough to break several ribs, leaving him drowning in a level of pain he had never felt before. The crowd watched with horror clear on their expressions as a shadow appeared before Silas. When it slowed enough for their eyes to catch up, they found a valiant youth with billowing white hair, his bare torso flaring up with an enraged red color. For the first time, Ryu's expression was something completely separate from calm and cold. It held an unbridled fury that pierced toward the heavens. His fists rained downward, each pounding leaving a noticeable dent, whether that be in Silas' armor or his body. He truly looked no different from a white devil. Ryu's fists came down in an unending torrent. He seemed possessed, yet his actions were incredibly controlled. If not, how could a mere middle-pulse opening realm expert like Silas survive for so long? Back away or ill kill him. Ryu didn't need to look back. He had calculated the amount of time it would take for Silas' protector to reach him. Considering they knew Ryu was blind and could still pull all of this off, they were smart enough to know that it didn't matter that his back was faced to them. If they stepped out of line, he would kill their crown prince without hesitation. There was no room for negotiation in his voice. Just like that, a carefully laid out plan went up in smoke. This was the very definition of what it meant for the largest fist to speak the loudest. Silas had been very confident in himself, but in the end, none of it mattered even the slightest bit. Silas' cries of pain and horror were unceasing. Minutes ticked by continuously without Ryu showing any signs of letting up. Even as his lungs screamed for him to take a break, his fists continued to fly forward. This moment for Ryu wasn't just about revenge. With every satisfying fist that landed, he felt more and more disconnected from this life, and more willing to leave it all behind. However, even as he forgot this life of his, Ryu was leaving Silas an unerasable memory. When he awoke from this, a cripple for life, he would remember that night he laughed at Granny Miriam's death. That night he treated the kind soul of an old woman as a prop for entertainment. Atticus, who was watching this scene unfold in the distance, felt his heart tremble. How could he not know what had enraged Ryu? He had been even more terrible than Silas that night. While Silas had only chuckled once and said practically nothing, he had drawn the picture of an old cougar lusting after young meat. If Ryu treated Silas like this, just how was he planning on treating him? At that moment, Atticus felt as though his soul had left his body. He knew he couldn't face Ryu, or else he would end up even worse off than Silas. But how could he concede his round either? If he as a crown prince did something so cowardly, his father would never allow him to ascend to the throne. The impact on their kingdom's faith would be too severe. Please stop, that's enough. The Viri kingdom commander called out to Ryu, almost pleading for him to stop. This was far too much. Silas' voice didn't even call out in agony anymore. All anyone could hear were faint whimpers. This wasn't because Silas didn't want to call out, but rather because his vocal cords were so badly damaged from his screams that they struggled to produce even the sounds that they did. Ryu didn't seem to hear those words at all. Silas' broken and bruised body could only lay limply, accepting Ryu's rage. To him, it felt as though not a single bone in his body had survived. The pain was unimaginable. Yet, what made the situation worse was the level of humiliation. He had stood atop of the world since the day of his birth. When had he ever experienced such a situation? Headmaster Leopold didn't know how to feel watching his disciple being treated in this way. Of course, he was aware of how black-hearted Silas was, but at the end of the day, he had raised him up from the time he was a toddler until now. No matter how bad of a person he was, this was simply too difficult to watch. In the end, he could only turn away. As the 2-hour mark slowly ticked to an end, Ryu's assault finally slowed. He stood in a crater of Silas' making, having pummeled him into the ground so continuously. The Viri kingdom's crown prince had acted as a spearhead that now sat badly mangled. Ryu's head tilted up and into the skies, his breathing so ragged and fierce it billowed with a scorching heat. Even in the moderately warm night air, it looked as though he was breathing fire. Next, Ryu's voice was laced with murderous intent, grumbling through the battle arena. He didn't seem to realize just how horrifying his actions were. From beginning to end, no prince had suffered such tremendous injuries. In fact, even when Ryu and Amori had their battle, Ryu went incredibly easy on his first brother, only rebuffing him continuously until the time limit came to an end. Who could have expected anything like this to happen? Ryu turned without another word, gliding by the Viri kingdom warriors as though they were nothing more than air. What did their anger have to do with him? He couldn't care less. King Viri didn't have the face to complain. If he did so, would he not only be acknowledging that his son was inferior, but also that their Viri kingdom couldn't take a loss in stride? If anything, his silence actually helped their plight. As the minutes trickled by during Ryu's beat-down of Silas, the crowd began to speculate just why Ryu had lost himself in anger. In the end, they concluded that he didn't like the fact Silas had slighted him during the second trial. This sort of conclusion made Ryu come off as a petty man who couldn't take the slightest resistance against himself in stride. He thwarted Prince Silas' plot in the second trial. Why did he have to do all of this? Members of the crowd couldn't help but ask themselves. At that moment, Ryu's image as an underdog they wanted to root for took a flip. He suddenly became a spoiled, albeit talented, prince who threw a temper tantrum for the smallest thing. As the crowd grew more rowdy, Tor Kingdom citizens suddenly thought about how horrible it would be to have a king like this, and began to clamor for the rules to be changed as well. Headmaster Leopold felt a headache coming on. The shift in public perception was so swift that even he began to feel some pressure. But when he looked toward Ryu, hoping that he'd say some words, Ryu didn't seem to be listening at all. Prince Atticus could only slowly prepare, hoping that the crowd's pressure could aid him. The cold sweat matting his back only seemed to grow with each passing second. It was as though a gaze was trained on him. No matter how he moved or shifted, he couldn't escape it. Seeing that they weren't getting their way, the crowd began to chant Prince Atticus' name. Beat him, take him down. Wipe that smug look off his face, Prince Atticus. Every word was like another nail in Atticus' coffin. His carefree, lustful gaze became clouded by fear. As he watched Prince Silas' broken and mangled body being carefully carried away, he felt like he was seeing a glimpse of the future. In the end, he had no choice but to step forward himself under the cheers of the crowd. No matter how the crowd chanted, no matter how many emotions and hopes they placed behind their words, Atticus' fate was far worse than even Silas. Even with the precautions he took, Ryu's speed was too ungodly. As things stood now, Ryu didn't even have 5% of his fighting strength. This so-called borderline spiritual severing realm speed of his couldn't even be considered his best. Yet it was more than enough to deal with these jokes of an enemy. Ryu stood on the edge of a building's roof, his glaive being held tightly to the side of his body as Atticus hung limply on the other side of it. Though it wasn't a lethal blow to a cultivator, Atticus' spine was still severed. Whether it would ever be reattached in the future was improbably. In the distance, not to mention King Lantes, whose rage had reached a boiling point, King Tor felt like leaping up and shredding Ryu to pieces. If he couldn't tell what Ryu was doing by now, wouldn't he be too much a fool? No matter what, he was still a man who ruled over the strongest kingdom of their higher mortal plane. Although those core members of Tor Kingdom were aware that Ryu's relationship with the Tor clan had long since been severed, did the public know this? In truth, the kings of the three opposing kingdoms should be aware. It was impossible to keep the discrimination Ryu faced as a prince under wraps. This was especially so after that damned patriarch Agnes had Ryu publicly whipped. There were too many witnesses to this matter. Armed with this knowledge, those kings should be clever enough to know what Ryu was attempting. It was just a difficult matter for them to handle easily due to public perception. They would definitely come to King Tor to demand restitution for their swallowing these events without a word. If you think this is enough to destroy my Tor kingdom, you're a fool. King Tor roared in his mind. He wasn't entirely wrong. Hoping to stoke the flames of war by Ryu's actions was nothing more than wishful thinking. It was obvious to now that King Tor was once more benefiting from Ryu's lack of understanding. Which kingdom didn't place hundreds of spies within the walls of their rivals? Tor Kingdom was also most likely a heavy focus of the three kingdoms as well, considering they had the highest strength. Ryu continued to hold Atticus up with his glaive, oblivious to the thoughts of King Tor. A lewd laughter left Atticus' lips before he winced in pain. I guess, *cough*, you loved that old cougar more than I thought. Ryu didn't say much to these words. Him doing so would only tell Atticus that he was bothered. Since it was clear who held the power in this situation, Did Ryu need to do such a thing? In the end, the 2-hour timer ran its course. Ryu absent-mindedly allowed Atticus to slip off of his glaive, causing not only the Land-Test prince to panic, but also the Land-Test warriors below. They only sighed a breath of relief when they managed to catch Atticus before he hit the ground. The next 2 rounds were no different. Kaden foolishly tried to fight a one-on-one battle with Ryu, only to end up routed for the entire 2-hour period. Even while he was beaten, bruised, and beaten, Kaden was no match for Ryu. He lost in physical strength. He lost in speed. He lost in technique. He lost in depth of comprehension. When the crowd saw how easy Ryu went on his third brother compared to the stark contrast with Silas and Atticus, they felt a deep sense of cognitive dissonance. Come to think of it, didn't he go easy of Kalman and Amory as well? Some who felt themselves clever felt a conspiracy brewing. Kalman and Quan were no longer threats with the destruction of the natural order sect. Maybe Ryu felt there was no need to trample on their dignity, but it was necessary to knock Land-Test and Viri Kingdom down a peg. Only those with high authority like Headmaster Leopold were aware that this was Ryu's own personal crusade. But that only made them shake their heads. The higher mortal plane had been at peace for too long. It was even to the point where they decided to hold these cooperative coronation games, instead of just laying waste to the Opus kingdom. What could Ryu hope to accomplish with these actions? After getting his revenge on Silas and Atticus, their 2 backer sects wouldn't spare any expense to cure them. And in the end, after suffering a small loss to recoup their costs, King Tor would still stand tall. Still, they continued to watch this futile fight, as Ryu decimated Quan's attempt as well. In truth, Prince Quan only attempted to stall, not even using a single chi refinement expert in hopes of saving them for his brother's turn, should it come. Luckily for him, Ryu also went easy, simply running for the 2-hour time period before sending him off. Finally, it was Amory's turn once more. He was forced to take on the mortal role, limiting him to 5 chi refinement experts, but he was also given 3 attempts at 5 hours each to succeed. No matter how many heaven-defying acts Ryu was a part of, he looked no different than an arrow at the end of its flight. How could he last another 15 hours? His breathing was haggard, the number of self-sutured wounds on his body were uncountable, and his body no longer had any ability to sweat. Even his Ice Phoenix martial form couldn't seem to saturate his blood with oxygen as efficiently anymore, leaving his lungs screaming in agony. As Amory's first attempt began, everyone could sense a conspiracy brewing. Ryu wasn't given any time to breathe as he was constantly pressed, time and time again. Those Amory brought this time weren't up to the standard of the Dragon Corps, but they were double in number and just as fervent. By the middle of Amory's second attempt, it became far more obvious what he was trying to do. No matter what hiding place Ryu chose, he was always smoked out. He was pressed, pressured, and continuously injured. After 7 rounds of dancing on death's blade edge, this 8th round was truly perilous. Once the second attempt came to an end, Ryu felt that his legs could hardly hold his own weight. He was forced to rely on the northern heavenly wind just to stop his knees from trembling. But the third attempt came without pause. This time, though Amory brought his 300 Dragon Corps warriors, they only loosely surrounded Ryu. As for who came forward, there was only one man, Death Guard Bishok. Death Guard Bishok's presence was just as dreary and brooding as ever. A dark cape draped over his thin body, causing his dark black hair to disappear into its fabric's folds. His pale skin shimmered under the high moonlight, appearing sickly and unkempt. His gait was reminiscent of slinking shadow, fleeting into and out of existence with an odd jerkiness that somehow maintained a trance-like pattern. Anyone who laid eyes on this man knew that he was a killer. No matter what happened, no matter what he faced or what befell him, his hand would always remain steady, his expression without ripple. The hearts of the spectators began to palpitate. After 3 days of these events, they believed that they had seen everything that was left to be seen. Many wanted these events to simply come to a close. A large majority had given up on ever winning the money they bet back. while another majority were happy that they bet on the Tor kingdom as a whole, despite the fact the return was far less. However, Bishok's appearance made their weary and tired limbs stand up tall, stretched taut as though the life he had come to claim was their own and not Ryu's. At that moment, many couldn't help but turn their attention to Ryu. He seemed completely spent. His sweat had dried to cake his skin with a coarse salt. His self-sutured wounds were blackening to an eerie degree, the product of him repeatedly agitating them with his every action, and his aura seemed to have fallen. He had once held an unbridled will to battle with anything that crossed his path, but now he just seemed tired and finished. No one had expected Ryu to make it this far. Even surviving the first round had been perilous. To make it here to the 8th, no matter how they felt about his treatment of Silas and Adikus, it was impressive. Bishok didn't speak any words. As for Ryu, he would never forget those oddly spaced footsteps as long as he lived. That feeling of weakness, the sound of the wind whooshing as his blade fell, the dull thump of Granny Miriam's head hitting the ground. He remembered it all, and it was this man before that sentenced her to death. Without a word, the both of them shot forward, warring with their fists. To Ryu, it felt as though every hit he suffered agitated his blood, pushing its boiling point to another level. Even in his peak state, a battle with Bishok would push him to his limits. This man wasn't like a brainless beast, nor was he like the war-trained Dragon Corps warriors. No, he was a killer. Sharp winds assaulted Ryu from Bishok's fists. It felt as though any error he made would lead to the end of his life. Without fail, with every exchange, Ryu was pushed backward. Bishok's fists were too heavy, his attacks too sharp, his schemes too cunning. Archers, ready your arrows. Amori's voice added a stunning coldness to the already brisk night air. His archers had made their way to line the tops of the city buildings, while his warriors created a net in the streets. By now, the crowd no longer felt that Amori was going too far. After watching Ryu escape time and time again, it became clear that his harsh, heartless methods were the only chance he stood. The tale of two brothers fighting for a bloodied throne was one they would tell their children for generations to come. Never would they know the underlying truths of these events. The hissing sound of twin daggers being unsheathed were so faint that even Ryu missed them. After observing him for a long time, it became clear to Bishok what his weaknesses were, or rather, what his weakness was: silence. By the time Ryu realized his mistake and reacted, a dagger had sliced across his right wrist, leaving his hand limping uselessly. Ryu had reached up to block, believing that Bishok was throwing yet another fist, only for the matter to end horribly. Loose your arrows. Amori grasped the opportunity perfectly. With Ryu's right hand gone to waste, it would be impossible for him to rely on his glaive to protect his right side, especially with Bishok pressing him. In fact, whenever Ryu used his glaive, he had always used his right hand. His left had to be his weakness. Although he had dual-wielded with his left, it had been awkward and flawed. Amori could finally see a path to victory. Bishok's second dagger hadn't paused for a single moment, slicing through the air with a deadly silence. Its target, Ryu's throat. At that same time, 50 arrows were let loose from every direction. This time, Ryu's movements had far less freedom. With one opponent pinning him down at point-blank range, even retreating was near impossible. With so many heavily trained archers seeking his life, what chance did he stand? It was at that moment that the situation completely changed. Ryu's eyes shot open, two globes of pristine silver shimmering in the night air. The three moons in the sky seemed to pale in comparison, unable to match their radiance. He's not blind. No one knew who said it first, but it sent a wave of shock over the crowd. They didn't understand what was happening. Was Ryu simply handicapping himself? For what purpose if so? But there was no time to think. At that moment, Bishok was laid bare before Ryu. He didn't know what had changed, but he suddenly felt Ryu had become an insurmountable mountain. That bitch! King Tor almost couldn't restrain his roar. If Ryu wasn't blind, there was only one person to blame. Even in death, she spit in his face. Repressed Kai within Ryu's eyes surged outward, filling his body. This sort of state would only last a mere moment. Although there were numerous energy reserves left in his eyes due to him not using them, the energy expenditure of the first-ranked heavenly pupils was far too much. Bishok's body shook under Ryu's gaze. He suddenly felt like he was looking into both the beginning and end of time. Even for him, a man who wouldn't be shocked by anything, he felt his soul shake to its very core. That small split second allowed Ryu to shoot backward, ducking under a swath of arrows to pull a spear out to his left hand. Ryu stood with his breath haggard, his right hand dripping with blood, as his eyes pierced through the night. All this time, he had used a single weapon aside from his bow. It was all to prepare for this very moment. While Bishok was preparing for a glaive wielder, Ryu would show him a god emperor, a spear. The thoughts of everyone began to run wild. Much like Amori, they had assumed that Ryu had a dominant hand, much like everyone else did. It was impossible to escape this universal truth, or so they thought. But even more importantly, they were certain that Ryu was a master of the glaive. And was he really not blind? Yana's eyes opened wide, an indescribable happiness coming over her. It pained her to see Ryu in such a state, but she suddenly felt herself overwhelmed by a calm when she stared into his eyes. Although it was only through a screen, it was as though she was enveloped by a gentle warmth. However, while Yana felt this way, Bishok couldn't have disagreed more. That mighty weight on his chest only seemed to grow with each passing moment. Time lengthened, placing him in an agonizingly slow loop that made a single second feel like hour. And then, Ryu shot forward. As things stood now, Ryu's condition had worsened considerably. Although he had done his best to dodge the arrows while retreating, two still pierced his back, both landing on his right shoulder blade, making that entire arm all the more useless. Still, he didn't seem to notice. It didn't take more than a moment for those spectating to realize that not only was Ryu's left hand just as proficient as his right, but he was also a spear master. Pierce, attack after pierce, attack rained down upon Bishok. As a dagger wielder, he was at a complete disadvantage, unable to close the distance. To make matters worse, Ryu's style had completely changed. If before his attack pattern could have been described as imposing and straightforward, now his strokes were clever and irritating. Of the Tatsuya saintly weapons, the glaive was known to manifest the war god. This was a man of character and imposing will, unwilling to take even a single step back. His attacks were simple but powerful, causing his enemies to quake where they stood. However, the spear manifested the god emperor. This was a man of war and character as well. However, he was also a ruler of a nation, not a tyrant like the war god. He didn't rule solely by strength, but also by the power of his mind. While he was no less imposing, his strikes were swift and well thought out, cornering his enemies like animals. Ryu's use of the glaive made Bishok believe that he had him pegged. However, this switch was so abrupt that the veteran assassin was immediately placed on his back foot, continuously deflecting the deadly strikes with his daggers. It didn't take a genius to understand that while the glaive's sweep, the spear's strongest strike was pierce, Ryu executed a series of advances, pressing Bishok backward, with him controlling the flow of the battle now. Even with a single arm hanging loosely to his side, Amori was in no position to launch another assault of arrows. If he did so, he was practically asking to get taken advantage of. Bishok's daggers glittered under the moonlight. Despite his situation, he didn't panic. In his long life, how could he not have faced his fair share of medium-ranged weapon masters? If all it took was a long weapon to win, why would anyone even choose the dagger or the sword? They might as well all become archers. Suddenly, Bishok's deadened eyes lit with a sparkle. The side of his right blade cleverly caught the side of Ryu's spear tip, gliding across the side of it and pushing it outward. In that moment, as Ryu's spear was pushed off course, Bishok's speed erupted, closing in the 3-meter gap between them. How could Ryu not realize what had happened? This was exactly the reason why spear wielders hated this move, but dagger wielders loved it. Bishok has just executed Skim, though he was far less proficient than Ryu at it, causing him to need to take his time to find the right opportunity. It was still beyond effective. In an instant, it seemed that Ryu's ranged advantage would come to an end. With his left arm still in the middle of attacking, and his right arm completely useless, what chance did he stand to stop this attack? His only option was to abandon his weapon and block with his left. But if he did that, he'd end up with yet another useless arm. However, who would have known at that moment that Ryu's eyes would calmly stare into the dark abyss that were Bishok's? A line of Kai extended from his lips, entering Bishok's ears. "You're too unskilled." These words hurt Bishok more than anything else ever could. He had spent his whole life refining his skills. From the moment he was born and found to have a rare earth skeletal grade, he was taken in by the Tor clan and nurtured into their death guard. He knew nothing but training and killing. Even women didn't interest him. After putting his whole life into this one craft, to listen to a 15-year-old tell you such a thing, how could he withstand such an insult? But Ryu's eyes didn't seem to care for his anger. He looked down on the death guard with absolute disdain. Like a bug he was only waiting to crush with a single step. At that moment, Ryu took action. His left wrist flexed with all its might, waiting for the perfect moment before whipping ferociously. Ryu's spear reacted at that very moment, bowing uncontrollably. Its wooden polearm curled beautifully under the moonlight, its reddened aura wafting with a will to kill. Skim could be used in all sorts of angles, in all sorts of situations. Why couldn't Ryu apply that same level of flexibility to his other basic stances? This attack of Ryu's was something he comprehended on his own. Whipping Pierce Bishok immediately noticed the spear curving around the curvature of his skim, and aiming directly for his head. Should this attack land, he would die without a doubt. But was he not a veteran of combat? He reacted without hesitation, pulling back his left-handed strike aimed for Ryu's throat and changing its course toward the polearm of Ryu's spear. Unfortunately, he wasn't fast enough. Even though daggers allowed far more freedom in changing attack angles, how could it be perfect? Ryu's spear tip managed to clip the edge of his nose. Even while Bishok pushed the spear away, it dug into a part of his skull, slicing across the top right half of his face and taking his eye with it. Ryu followed up with a kick to Bishok's knee, crippling him into filling the night air with blood-curdling screams. Without mercy, Ryu's spear found Bishok's throat, pinning him into the cobbled road. Cold, silver eyes watched as the death guard slowly bled to death, his life force dissipating with each passing moment. Despite the weakness in his knees, Ryu stood tall, his left arm holding the spear that pierced Bishok's throat steady. Ryu had never killed before. Or rather, he had never killed a human before. Watching the life slowly flow out from the death guard almost felt surreal. He didn't feel any sense of guilt or remorse. He just felt a discomfort. Believe it or not, this discomfort had nothing to do with Bishok's fleeting life. Instead, it was only at that moment it really sunk into him that no matter what he did, Granny Miriam wouldn't be coming back. As things stood now, he could only do his best to honor her memory properly. Bishok's deep black eyes looked up to see Ryu's disdainful gaze. Even at the end, he could hardly fathom the move that took his life. Whipping Pierce wasn't a move that was possible to pull off if wielding with both hands. Well, it was possible, but there were two possible less than pleasing outcomes. The first was in a case where a normal-sized spear was used, thus resulting in limited effectiveness. If a hand choked up along the spear's polearm, the effect of curving the spear would be severely lessened, making it near meaningless. The second outcome would result from a master using a spear that was already excessively long and flexible. Sometimes these spears would reach 3, 4, even 5 meters in length, and would be purposely designed to have incredibly flexible polearms. In that case, whipping Pierce could be executed with 2 hands, but the accuracy would be lacking considering the length of the spear. Whipping Pierce could only be used so perfectly with 1 arm. However, that didn't mean that this technique wasn't incredibly difficult to use. Just the pressure on Ryu's wrist alone would have shattered it had Ryu had a normal bone structure. Luckily, the dexterity and flexibility provided by his ice jade crystal body helped him out tremendously. Then there was the difficulty in controlling the technique itself. If Ryu used too little force, the spear wouldn't arch enough. If the curve was too small, then it would be impossible to have bent around Bishok's defenses in that way. But if the force was too strong, it was possible to miss the target entirely, or even snap a spear if it was as low quality as Ryu's current one. All of these factors were matters that masters like Bishok and the spiritual severing realm experts watching understood. In fact, they were in complete awe. Even Amori, who hadn't invested much time in combat and cultivation, was floored, so much so that he completely blanked on what step to take next. As things stood now, Ryu was still heavily injured, with his right side being almost completely useless. In addition, those with sharper senses could see that there was a great deal of stress on his left arm after executing that technique, even more so than what he had experienced dual wielding. And it was obvious that he could only just barely stand up on his own 2 legs. With just under 3 hours remaining in their last 5-hour attempt, one would think Amori still stood a chance. After all, he still had Ryu surrounded from all sides. But Ryu's piercing gaze placed too much pressure on their hearts. It somehow felt that even if he was limbless, with his heart pierced through, he would still find a method to victory. In that moment, a small soul jade King Tor kept on his wrist shattered with an audible cracking sound. Soul jades worked on a similar parent-child system the visual jades that recorded the princes did, except this time, one half was the soul of a living being. Some forms of soul jades could also be used to form binding contracts between a master and a servant. The fact it shattered meant only one thing: Death Guard Bishok had died. King Tor clenched his fists, a pulse vein slowly occupying larger and larger real estate on his forehead. It seemed as though he could pop at any given moment. By the time Amori recovered and ordered the troops to move in on Ryu, the situation had become helpless. A familiar tale of Ryu dancing on Death's blade played before everyone's eyes. No one knew when it happened exactly, but the crowd became overwhelmed by a sense of calm that was only possible when the victor was clear. It didn't make sense for them to feel this way. Ryu truly was too tired, too beaten, too cut up and bruised, but that seedling of confidence that only an undefeated legend could provide was blooming in full force. Ryu made fools of what remained of the Dragon Core. It was as expected. With his eyes opened, he was on an entirely different level. They had no doubt that had his eyes been open this entire time, maybe not even a speck of dust would have landed upon him, let alone the injuries he suffered now. With third perspective, Ryu didn't need to rely on his depleted spiritual sense, and since insight could even predict a warrior like Bishok's skim to perfection, what did these second-rate warriors of the Cedar clan's Dragon Core have on him? Time ticked. 3 remaining hours became 2, 2 became 1, and finally, mere minutes trickled down to seconds, all for Headmaster Leopold's voice to ring out once more. This third and final attempt has come to a close. The winner, an undisputed first-place closer of this third trial, Prince Ryu Tor. There was no expected fanatical cheering or grandiose display. The man who won didn't even so much as smile as he looked up at the moons which had reached their highest points. Suddenly, a loud whistle left Ryu's lips. A second-order flying beast swooped down from the skies, catching many off guard. King Tor's heart seized. He couldn't allow Ryu to leave like this, but how could he make such a public move against his son? Plus, how did that damned bird approach so closely without him noticing? However, when he lay eyes on it, he suddenly understood. The obscured sky falcon didn't have any real combat prowess, but its speed and concealment abilities outshone even many third-order beasts. Not just King Tor, but even the crowd suddenly understood that if Ryu really wanted to cheat, he could have done so far more easily than he had. Who could have reached him if he simply sat in the skies? There was no need to say that many tried to follow after Ryu that night, not a single one of whom had good intentions. Two kingdoms wanted to assassinate him so that he couldn't lead the Tor clan to greater heights, while his own father wanted nothing more than to see his corpse. But with the help of his cloak, what chance did they stand? Days later, back in Tor Palace, King Tor was in yet another fit of rage. His graying hair whipped about wildly as he threw anything he could get his hands on across his own office. One could imagine the kind of commotion a chi refinement expert would cause doing such a thing daily. But who had the courage to tell a king to stop? Not even the imperial censors dared to do a thing after he killed one of their own. King Tor had exhausted all his options, even breaking the rules to send out his own father to search for Ryu personally. Yet somehow, Ryu evaded the eyes of even a half-step divine vessel expert. To make matters worse, the dark clouds from Ryu's awakening still perpetually hung above the Tor Kingdom. Having not seen the sun in almost 2 years now, the citizens of Tor Kingdom were becoming restless. "Royal husband, you cannot continue to do this." Queen Olivia Tor tried to calm Shuren down. Though this was the palace, there were countless servants, ministers, and miscellaneous persons on its grounds. If rumors that the king had lost his mind began to spread, it would make an already terrible situation worse. However, Olivia's efforts were responded to with a crisp slap. Stunned, Olivia could only remain silent. "You damned woman! Do you think I don't know what you and your father have been plotting all this time? If it wasn't for my certainty that you would have backstabbed me otherwise, I would have chosen Leilani as my queen. How many matters in this palace have been your doing? You're related to Selene's matter, aren't you? I'm surprised you even allowed Leilani to give birth at all with that vindictive, dark personality of yours." Too many terrible things had occurred in Tor Palace after Olivia became queen. How could King Tor not understand that? However, the Cedar clan was too powerful, so he had to find a way to cripple them from within. As such, he gave up on love and married Olivia instead. But he was beginning to regret even that. With a genius like Ryu as his son, what did a trash clan like the Cedars matter? It was clear by now that King Tor had lost his mind. He had already forgotten that Ryu's ostracization had nothing to do with the Cedar clan, and everything to do with his actions alone. To stonewall your own son due to the color of his hair and eyes, yet have the audacity to take a moral high horse. Wasn't he too shameless? Ryu's disappearance was like yet another looming guillotine over Tor Kingdom. When he reappeared next, would it be the day King Tor abdicated, or would he appear beforehand? "Royal husband," Olivia said in a decidedly softer voice, trying to ignore the stinging pain on her cheek. Despite the enraged boiling sitting in her gut at the king's words, she kept her composure. "Although that unfilial son of yours acted in defiance, it still benefits you, does it not?" King Tor's brow furrowed. "Speak." "Ryu placed first. Amori placed second. Wydrek placed third. Whether it was Ryu's intention or not to the world, he is still a member of the Tor clan. According to the original deal, this means that not only does the Tor clan get first pick of the resources of the past natural order sect, it also means that we get the largest share as well. Though Ryu threw a tantrum, all he did was help you. I hear that the natural order sect's heirloom is incredibly powerful and is ranked first among the treasures of our highest mortal plane. What need is there to fear Ryu with it in your hands? King Tor's eyes lit up like a blazing torch. Like this, the cogs began to move. Asterisk asterisk, the heads of the 4 kingdoms coalesced just a few weeks later. King Tor's mood had been greatly elevated as well. King Viri and Lantes still didn't feel great being in the same room with a Tor, mostly because what Ryu had done to their sons was still fresh in their minds. They immediately used this to leverage better positions for themselves and more resources. Namely, the Viri kingdom laid claim to the elemental pavilion techniques, while the Lantes kingdom laid claim to the weapons and human pavilions. King Tor happily ceded these things, his eyes completely focused on the prospect of owning the glove of order. Each kingdom sent a spiritual severing expert. Although they weren't allowed to take part in worldly affairs, this matter was a definite exception. After all, it was related to the treasures of a sect, something that was by definition a martial world affair. Plus, only they would be able to forcibly break the protective formation was with such an expert. In truth, it was quite a shame to shatter this formation. There was no one on the mortal planes capable of creating such a large-scale formation anymore. In fact, these formations were laid by powers of the immortal plane back, when they treated the higher mortal plane as their backyard. They were just repurposed by these sects to their benefit. Days passed as half a dozen spiritual severing realm experts attacked the illusory formation. Still, despite the hard work, their eyes seemed to grow brighter and brighter with each passing moment. The prospect of an entire sect's worth of resources was far too enticing. 3 days later, the formation finally collapsed under the pressure. By the 5th day, it lost its ability to self-repair, allowing what remained of it to be torn away. The kings smiled confidently. All this time they had completely ignored King Opes. Without Ryu supporting them, the Opes princes collapsed in on themselves. Although Kalman fought valiantly, managing to place 4th due to Adikus and Silas being unable to participate, in the grand scheme of things, it mattered naught. Still, King Opes' lips inexplicably twitched, the telltale sign of someone trying their best to hold back their laughter. If the 3 kings saw this, there was no question that they would have sensed that something was off with these events. However, they were too excited. Each followed by 2 spiritual severing realm experts, the kings walked forward, trying to maintain their kingly auras despite the happiness in their hearts. In that moment, the calm spring atmosphere of the natural order sect was invaded by a piercing cold and rushing snow. Without the formation's protection, the cold temperatures of Opes' kingdom were no longer held back by anything. Suddenly, roars of anger sounded. The 3 kings spent hours overturning every stone, yet they didn't find a single thing worthy of being labeled as a treasure. The kings could do nothing. Over half a decade of preparation, all to receive absolutely nothing in the end. No matter how refined or kingly they tried to be, no human in existence could take this sort of matter lying down without throwing a rampage. However, the matter was kept under wraps. There was no way the kings could allow it to become public knowledge that they had been humiliated in such a way. In the end, they concluded that they had simply misjudged the immortal who started all of this. Clearly, even someone of his caliber couldn't ignore the wealth of an entire sect and ended up making a move in the end. In fact, they even believed he felt embarrassed to the point he gave the natural order sect disciples a proper burial. If curses could kill, that immortal, even with his depth of cultivation, would have long since died. The public would never believe that their kings could curse so profoundly, unless they spent the last few days with them. It was truly a sight to behold. Like this, the kingdoms fell into relative silence. Talks of the coronation games continued in full force for the first few weeks, but soon, even that calmed considerably. However, it was during this time that undercurrents began to brew, and the first sign was a secret meeting King Opes called with the Lantes and Viri kingdoms. King Opes, you claim to call us here for a matter related to the secrets of our kingdom's founding. But why is it that King Tor isn't here? What are you planning? King Viri's eyes narrowed. After receiving King Opes' messages, the 2 of them had rushed here. The secrets pertaining to the underground White Devil cult murals was one only kings and former kings knew of. It was also a secret they were bound from speaking of to anyone but their crown princes. Not even their other heirs had the right to know. So one can imagine that if such a matter was used to call upon them as kings, there was no doubt that they would heed it with the utmost haste. Yet they had arrived here only to find out that one of them was missing. If King Opes really called them here for this matter, King Tor would definitely have been here as well. Since he wasn't, that only meant one thing. A conspiracy was brewing. Seeing that King Lantes was just as displeased as King Viri, King Opes could only shake his head. These 2 had been in terrible moods ever since their crown princes had been crippled. These moods were only made worse after they received nothing for their troubles. Even with all their resources, it would be at least a half-decade before Adikus and Silas could live a semblance of a normal life. Look past your anger for a moment. Since I've called you here, there's obviously a purpose. And since I've excluded one of us, that purpose is incredibly important. The two kings frowned, but waited patiently for the answer they sought. We've been cheated. King Opes finally said, "What do you mean by that?" King Lantes probed. He already had a faint idea. In fact, not just him, but in all likelihood, King Viri was skeptical as well. Since they were kings, how could they be stupid? Too many things about these events didn't add up, and it all seemed to revolve around Ryu. I'm sure since I'm aware of it, you two are aware of it as well, correct? What happened almost 4 years ago, just a few days before Tor Kingdom was shrouded in black clouds. King Lantes and Viri looked at each other before nodding. Silas and Atticus had no reason to keep it from their fathers. They had heard rumors that the fourth prince was being ostracized by the Tor clan, but they didn't learn to what extent until the events of that night. They had been absolutely shocked by the matter. I wonder, how much of it do you two believe? The reports were very clear, even without the testimony of our sons. It was obvious that King Tor was trying to separate himself from his fourth son, even allowing him to be beat in public. Plus, after seeing his hair and eyes, isn't it obvious why that was? King Viri offered. I'm not saying that King Tor didn't initially hate his fourth son's existence initially. What I'm wondering is if he still does. Stop speaking in riddles. We're all intelligent men here, just get to the point. King Lantes said impatiently. What I'm saying is that, isn't it too convenient that it was the very day the first prince invited your sons over to speak of an alliance that these matters occurred to the Tor clan's fourth prince, or, I guess, crown prince now? And don't you find it odd that the Tor clan would allow your sons to be witness to such a thing? Even if they hated Crown Prince Tor to the core, they surely wouldn't want to give you an opportunity to use that against them. No. Imagine the devastation just a few rumors could cause. The three of us know that if Crown Prince Tor really wasn't King Tor's son, that he would have had both third concubine Leilani and him killed silently. The fact they survived to this day means that King Tor had already properly verified the matter. However, would the general public think so far? King Lantes and Viri's eyes narrowed. King Tor might have hated Crown Prince Tor after his birth because his appearance would cause unrest. But what if he suddenly found out that the benefits his fourth son brought him far outweighed the negatives? You two saw it all for yourselves. Crown Prince Tor is a talent words can't even describe. With King Tor's insight and his comprehension of talent as one himself, would he miss such a thing? What are you trying to say? I'll get to the point then, gentlemen. I believe that King Tor, utilizing his son's talents, staged this entire mess. With Crown Prince Tor as bait, he lured an immortal to take him as a disciple, and in exchange, he received the natural order sex resources for himself. King Lantes and Viri weren't as shocked as one might expect, having reached the logical conclusion. This is all just your speculation. Where is the proof? King Opes smiled. With a thought, a very familiar visual jade appeared in his hand. Soon, it began to replay flickering images of Ryu's battle with the fire tiger. Suddenly, the image paused between flickers to show a young man with white billowing hair, holding a black bow they recognized all too well. That bow, that glove. King Viri and King Lantes spoke out at the same time. Everyone knew that bow all too well. Despite the heavenly body sect being supported by the most talent and the strongest clans, the natural order sect was always able to stand as their equal. Why was that? It was precisely because of the bow in Ryu's hand and the glove that ran up his arm. It took several moments for King Viri and Lantes to calm themselves and collect their thoughts. Just what did it mean for this to happen? Were the Tors really responsible for clearing out the whole of the natural order sect? Had they been played? In the end, King Viri shook his head. I admit that you do have reason and evidence to support your thoughts, but there are too many problems with this. Even if Crown Prince Tor managed to get his hand on his bow, how do we know that the Tor clan was involved? No matter what, Ryu Tor was beaten like a dog on the streets of Tor City. Then he limped home, suffering the gazes and ridicule of almost everyone. How could it be possible for someone to endure such hardship, yet still display filial piety. If you ask me, it's more likely that Ryu Tor's natural awakening alerted the experts of the immortal plane. You know as well as I do that the only reason our best talents are of the earth grade at best is because everyone above that grade are taken away the moment they awaken. It's less of a logical stretch if Ryu Tor was taken in by an immortal. This would explain how he so suddenly disappeared for almost 2 years. Now he's back for his revenge. In fact, King Viri's eyes narrowed. Ryu Tor seemed to have quite a good relationship with your sons, even helping them out multiple times. How do we know that he isn't putting you up to this in exchange for a portion of your sex resources? As expected, kings weren't fools. King Viri's conclusion was actually very close to the truth, yet it only took him a moment to think of it. Ryu had indeed come to King Opes with his plans. As far as King Opes knew, everything King Viri said was the truth. However, would Ryu be one to form such a half-baked plot? King Opes remained silent for a moment. Your words are logical. Maybe I was a bit too rash. I should have thought of this possibility occurring as well. Now that you say it, there are a few inconsistencies. For example, Ryu killing such an important member of the Tor clan power structure in Death Guard Bishak is a bit odd. However, I still believe that there is more evidence on my side of thinking. For one, by your logic, Crown Prince Tor should have hated his brothers to the core as well. After all, while your sons enraged him by being witness to Imperial Doula Miriam's death, wasn't first Prince Amori the reason they were there in the first place? Ryu Tor had plenty of chances to cripple not just his first brother, but also his second and third brothers as well. Secondly, there's the matter of Ryu Tor's blindness. Why did he hide it for so long? Knowing King Tor, he definitely would have ordered someone to permanently blind his fourth son if what you say is correct. But not only is Ryu Tor not blind, he actually hid it until he forced into a corner he couldn't get out of like he had before. Thirdly, King Opes smiled lightly. Do you all know what happened on the date of Ryu Tor's birth? King Viri and Lantes were slowly wavering in their own conclusions, so when they heard this, their ears couldn't help but perk up. I'm sure you all know that after Ryu Tor was born, Tor Kingdom went into a lockdown that I assume was implemented in order to hide the appearance of the fourth prince. Like myself, I'm sure you too were very interested in why that was, so just like me, you likely contacted your various spies immediately. No. The two kings nodded, and I'm sure that, once more like me, you too didn't find anything. Everything was sealed up tight. It wasn't until things laxed in later years that we found out the truth, correct? The two kings nodded once more. I should tell you too that although I didn't find out anything about Ryu Tor's birth back then, I found something far more interesting. King Opes smiled. I learned that Queen Olivia had ordered meridian severing powder through various channels, and the one she asked to administer the poison was none other than Death Guard Bishak. King Viri and Lantes sucked in a cold breath. Meridian severing powder was too vicious and rare a poison, especially when used on an unborn child. In fact, the supply was so low that there were only a few places it was possible to buy this poison on their higher mortal plane, places that were heavily monitored by all four kingdoms. This wasn't even the most important point. If what King Opes said was true, then not just Ryu, but even King Tor would want Death Guard Bishak killed for betraying him. But since the Heir clan was involved, they would have to do it in such a way that they weren't alerted, or else it would stir up inner conflict. The coronation games were basically the best opportunity. How could you possibly know that it was Death Guard Bishak that she ordered to do such a thing? This question was the most important. If King Opes had a good answer, this could change everything. I don't, King Opes said with a light smile, but he certainly does. At that moment, the attention of the two kings were shifted as a certain individual walked into King Opes' office. When they saw who it was, a sudden realization came over them. Many years ago, the Garis clan had suffered a major slap to the face at the hands of the Heir clan, though in the end, the matter was buried by the imperial censors. How could the Garis clan forget the humiliation they faced? Back then, the Garis clan had used all resources at their disposal to enact justice for themselves. But they reached a dead end. Unable to do anything, they could only resign themselves to fate. This turn of events was what changed the old general's outlook on life, making him believe that if he wasn't as harsh with his clan as those others were with theirs, his family would only suffer even more humiliation in the future. Why was it that even the old general had to give up? After years of investigation, they found the insurmountable wall that was Death Guard Bishak at the end of it all. And who was it that walked into the room just now? It was none other than Second Prince Wydrek Tor. Your Highnesses. Wydrek cupped his fists. King Lantes immediately felt apprehensive. He understood that it was likely Wydrek and his Garis clan that had insider information. But wasn't Wydrek being here far too dangerous? The net the Tor clan set was far too wide. In addition to this, King Lantes and Viri, thinking that this was a meeting all four kings were aware of, hadn't bothered to hide their tracks either. Two kings traveling to the Opes kingdom at the same time. How could the Tor clan's guard not be up? In fact, King Tor might already be aware of this. With Wydrek here, it only made matters worse. As though seeing through their thoughts, Wydrek smiled. There's no need for you all to worry about the Tor clan tracking my whereabouts. I haven't been in Tor Kingdom for several years already. I have many businesses to handle within all four kingdoms, so it's not suspicious for me to be here. These words caused the two kings to breathe a slight breath of relief. That was right. Second Prince Tor was well known for his control over the higher mortal plane's economy. He had been infiltrating their kingdoms with his businesses for a long time already. So, there really was nothing suspicious about him being here. Even if the Tor clan found out, it wouldn't be a big deal. However, that didn't solve the problem entirely. You all might be wondering what King Tor would think of you two coming here, I presume. King Opes added, there's no need to worry about this either. I sent an invitation to King Tor as well. It was just that he rejected it. The two kings came to a sudden realization. King Opes likely sent all three of them invitations, but King Tor, in all his arrogance, likely felt it was beneath him to attend personally. After all, he was by far the most powerful of them all. So, he would have sent an envoy or representative of some sort. In fact, since Wydrek was out of the kingdom already, that representative might have been the second prince himself. Genius, they couldn't help but think to themselves. Had King Opes always been so cunning, they raised their guard slightly. I will get right to the point. Wydrek said seriously, I would like you two to declare war against the Tor clan and the Heavenly Body sect. Are you insane? Both kings stood in a rage. Although they had expected this, it was far too crazy. Did they already forget that King Tor had been able to enlist the help of an immortal? On top of this, there was how ridiculously talented Ryu was to take into consideration. Even if this succeeded, Ryu would always have the opportunity for revenge in the future. To top this off, even without the help of the immortal, the Tor kingdom itself was a behemoth. The Heir clan alone could match up to their kingdoms in strength. If the three of them declared war, even if the Heir and Tor clans' relationship wasn't so good, they would band together for the sake of splitting the higher mortal plane between each other and getting rid of them. No matter how you looked at the situation, it was a lose-lose-lose sort of prospect. These kings didn't have a death wish. What if I guarantee that the Garis clan will defect to your side at the most opportune time? Wydrek asked calmly. The two kings froze. Although the Heir and Tor clans were powerful, more than 80% of their secular army was controlled by the Garis clan. They had always been a military family. Even though the secular army didn't have any high-level experts, what they did have were numbers. The Tor kingdom army was as large as their three kingdoms combined. Suddenly, the two kings saw a path, but they were still too skeptical. At the end of the day, the top experts are all firmly controlled by either the Tor or Heir clans. Even if a large majority of the secular army defects, it will be hard to close that gap. At best, we could say we would then be equal to them, but that's not good enough to declare such a large-scale war. King Lantes said after he calmed himself. And what if a war between the Heir and Tor clan is sparked first? Wydrek dropped another bomb. How? The two kings asked after looking at each other. For the past few weeks, rumors of my fourth brother's connection with the White Devils have been ramping up. You all saw it for yourselves. His eyes were silver. While you three have concluded that this is likely due to my father hiding Ryu, what do you think the general public thinks? That Crown Prince Tor isn't King Tor's son and that King Tor knows this, yet sheltered him anyway. Exactly, Wydrek said confidently. That Patriarch Heir bastard won't miss this opportunity. After that incident all those years ago left my aunt bedridden even to this day. My Garis clan has spent everything they have monitoring the Heir clan's every movement. This was how we learned that Deathguard Bishak had long been won over to the Heir clan's side, because that whore Olivia spread her legs. According to our informants, great undercurrents are already moving. Even Imperial Censor Briggs is getting involved, slowly bringing ministers over to their cause. Within a month the Heir clan will strike. Because Ryu won, becoming Crown Prince, they can't afford to wait any longer. The two kings began to breathe heavily. Everything seemed to be falling into place. The more Wydrek spoke, the more their concerns fluttered away. This was their chance to finally rid themselves of a behemoth that controlled their lives for too long. I know that you two are still worried about the immortals' intervention. But remember, if that immortal could interfere freely, why would King Tor go through so much trouble to hide everything? Why did Ryu need to pretend to be blind for so many years? Why did he have to be beaten and humiliated on the streets? Why didn't my weak-willed father boldly flaunt that he had the natural order sex resources, instead of putting the life of his most talented son on the line with the coronation games? Those words were the final straw that broke the camel's back. The undercurrent of a brewing conspiracy raged to life. The next year would be one of the most volatile in higher mortal plane history, and the man responsible for it all didn't even have to lift a finger. In fact, the young man in question was currently meditating silently beneath Opes Palace, utilizing the pool of spiritual chi to slowly chip away at what remained of his spiritual entrance pulse. At that moment, a surge of spiritual chi erupted as an audible shattering resounded. Ryu had finally completely opened his 13th pulse and entered the spiritual entrance realm. Within the human body, there were 13 total pulses. 6 were known as body pulses, another 6 were known as chi pulses, and the final one was the spiritual entrance pulse. A large part of the reason Ryu had yet to break through aside from not having an appropriate cultivation technique was precisely because he felt that these 13 should be linked in some sort of way. Though Ryu didn't know much of anything about cultivation after the pulse opening realm, his parents had drilled him continuously about the so-called perfect start. As such, he knew quite well how important opening all of his pulses was. Even after killing Deathguard Bishak, Ryu wasn't exactly proud of himself. The standard of the higher mortal plane was just too pitiful. Many didn't even know that there were 6 chi and body pulses, and even those that did never dared to open the final 2, sticking to 4 total. There was no need to even speak about the spiritual entrance pulse. It was neglected entirely. This was all to say that jumping cultivation realms wasn't as easy as it seemed. Ryu doubted that he could last more than 10 moves against a peak chi refinement expert of the immortal planes. This was simply the difference in quality of expert. Ryu knew he had to get stronger, and his path to improvement might ironically be hidden on this higher mortal plane he looked down upon so much. Ryu stood, his eyes opening to reveal what seemed like beams of light. He felt as though the whole world had been opened up to him. Not only had his spiritual sense awakened long before it should have, its birth seemed to have a great effect on his third perspective. Not only was its range larger, increasing to just over 100 meters, Ryu could faintly feel that he could see through walls. Though doing so drastically dropped his range, it still definitely intrigued him. As for Ryu's normal spiritual sense, it now had a permanent range of about 30 meters, without him having to enter Breath of Earth. This would make it more convenient for him to continue being blind, though he opened his eyes during the coronation games in order to benefit his plans. He didn't want to make a habit of it until he could find something fully capable of hiding the abilities of his heavenly pupils. Ryu pushed these things to the back of his mind, walking slowly to the edge of the pool of spiritual chi. The fragmented memory jade at the bottom seemed to be teasing him. However, now, Ryu felt he could finally do something about it. Taking a deep breath, Ryu's eyes began to shine with a blinding light. Spatial chi began to coalesce. Slowly but surely, a small whirlpool of gray kai touched the surface of the pool of spiritual chi. This persisted for several minutes. Although nothing seemed to be happening, the sweat that matted Ryu's forehead told a completely different story. It looked as though he was suffering through hell. Hours later, Ryu collapsed, gasping for breath. He could only quickly enter a meditative stance, trying to replenish his kai. Someone who had been watching this would have been confused beyond belief. But those who were sharper would have noticed that the square pool of spiritual chi had dropped by several centimeters. This was exactly Ryu's plan. Even if it took months, even if it took years, he would slowly draw all of the spiritual chi into his inner world. This way, not only would he gain a valuable resource for cultivating his mental realm, he would also gain the secrets of memory jade fragment. Some might call Ryu a madman. After all, he had no idea what was in the memory jade. For all he knew, it carried nothing at all. All Ryu had to go on was his intuition as a ruin master. Before, Ryu couldn't have hoped to do this. For one, last time he came here, he was far too weak. And secondly, he hadn't had the time. If he wasted months trying to get to the bottom, he would have missed the coronation games, or would have had too little time to prepare. What Ryu could accept into his inner world was limited to his cultivation. For example, he couldn't transport those massive blocks of breaking ore into his eye, because he didn't have the kai to sustain such a transfer. At the same time, though, Ryu was the only one among the heavenly pupil wielders that could pull off this feat. This was because he was likely the only one with an origin grade treasure fused to his eye. Without the incubator, this would have failed. If Ryu tried this tactic without the incubator, the moment the spiritual chi entered his eye, it would flood his mental realm, causing it to balloon and possibly explode. After all, his inner world was a part of his body. However, the incubator was a separate entity entirely. Ryu was taking full advantage of this loophole. These limitations were also part of the reason Ryu hadn't taken the chi-whispering grass, or bone, separating root into his eye yet. One had to remember that the greatest function of Ryu's incubator wasn't its ability to speed the maturity of spiritual ingredients, but rather its ability to perfectly extract the energy of these ingredients and pass it to its owner in a perfect and gentle form. This ability made it far better than pills, not only in effect, but also because one wouldn't have to deal with pill impurities. The issue was that Ryu's cultivation wasn't strong enough to absorb earth-grade spiritual ingredients into his inner world. It was truly a frustrating thing. With the incubator, even absorbing an origin-grade spiritual ingredient would be gentle and easy. However, because his cultivation was too low, Ryu couldn't get it into the incubator in the first place. Unfortunately, spiritual ingredients all came with a large amount of energy stored within them. The higher grade the ingredient, the more energy it stored. This energy made those ingredients harder for Ryu to absorb, because the amount of spatial kai required to do so grew cooperatively with grade increase. Essentially, until Ryu's kai output could match the weakest divine vessel realm expert, he could forget about absorbing earth-grade spiritual ingredients. For now, they'd have to sit in his spatial ring. Luckily, the spiritual chi pool was a different matter. It wasn't one whole entity, so Ryu could take it drop by drop. By limiting the amount he took in at once, he could bypass this weakness of his. All he needed was time. The months began to slowly trickle. As Ryu whittled away at the spiritual chi pool, the flames of war were igniting as the Heir clan attempted to forcibly seize power. Half a year later, While the Sea-Dare-Tor inner conflict was at its peak, the Opes-Viri-Lantes alliance began to mobilize its army. It was only after they finally set out that the last of the pool entered Ryu's eye. Finally, a beautiful crystalline memory jade cooled his hand to the touch. Just what was hidden inside. Memory jades had ranks of their own. From lowest to highest one had white, green, blue, violet, red, black, and finally, crystalline memory jades. These ranks didn't necessarily correspond to how valuable what was inside it was, but what it did correspond to was just how much information a memory jade could withstand, and also the kind of information it could store. Due to the distortion of the spiritual chi pool, Ryo hadn't had any idea what the color of the memory jade was previously. But now that he held it in his hand, he couldn't help but be baffled. White, green, and blue memory jades could easily store up to heaven-grade techniques. Even some simpler mystical-grade techniques would fit. Violet memory jades were large enough that even an origin-grade technique could fit, and still have plenty of room to spare. One might wonder, just what were the point of red, black, and crystalline jades then? Well, the answer came in the form of kind of information. Red and black memory jades were able to hold the consciousness of past individuals. They could also hold a replaying of history, even allowing one to relive wars that lasted thousands of years down to the most minute details. Then what of crystalline jades? They could hold entire holy lands. Crystalline jades often held the legacy of an entire clan. They could also hold the shadows of their ancestors, every technique they had ever grasped or learned, and even comprehension of those techniques. Some could hold insights into natural enlightenments and even mortal endowments. The range of possibilities was almost endless. Some larger clans even used crystalline jades to give their young geniuses life-saving measures. One could crush those crystalline jades to release the comprehension an elder had of a certain attack or defense, thus saving a genius who had their backs against the wall. Knowing all of this, one could understand why Ryu, despite his usual coldness, felt a slight excitement. Anything that would help him bring his family back together faster was something worth celebrating. He was now even more certain that his decision was the right one. Soon, Ryu calmed himself. He realized that while a crystalline jade offered the most opportunity, it also signified the most danger. There was no telling what was hidden within. Whoever went through so much trouble to bury these fragments away definitely wouldn't want just anybody benefiting from them. Ryu looked away from the jade, debating with himself about to do. In the end, he chose to take the risk. He simply didn't feel like his own talent was enough to cover the sky with a single palm. He needed all of the help he could get. He knew very well that this could be the moment he died, but he had already braved death once. What did a second time mean to him? With a deep breath, his mind delved into another world. Ryu's mind swirled. It almost felt like he had stepped onto a teleportation formation, but his body was still in place. This would have caused an incredibly odd cognitive dissonance in many. But for Ryu, who had delved into more crystalline jades than he could bother to count, he felt right at home. It reminded him of the times he'd spend days, even weeks on end in Shrine Library, with no one but Nuri by his side. Soon, Ryu's mind cleared. He found himself in a fragmented world one could only expect from a fragmented jade. The skies were splintered like broken grass. Ryu floated on air that should have been a beautifully paved road, and the large, almost endless palace in the distance a fourth its true size. Ryu didn't take long to walk forward. In fact, it didn't take any time at all. Since it was a projection of his mind, he only had to will himself to appear before the Silver Palace, and he was there. Quietly absorbing and taking everything in, Ryu nodded to himself. As expected, this memory jade was deliberately splintered, so whoever did so had taken great care not to damage the inheritance left within, or else what would have been the point in leaving them behind in the first place? From the architecture, Ryu placed these remnants in the Sky God era. This made perfect sense. After all, the protective formations on the fountain that led here were also originally from the sky god era. It also seems that everything here is perfectly placed to soothe one's mental state. Ryu thought to himself, walking through the palace. Although 3/4 of it was gone, what remained was beautiful. Even the fragmented portions had an art to them. This was definitely designed by a master in feng shui. Ryu swept through the palace floor by floor. It didn't take long for him to realize that it was split into 4 tiers total. Although it was easy for him to walk to every level, 3 of the floors were so fragmented that there was nothing to be gained. After a cursory glance, Ryu realized that only the 2nd floor allowed him to explore anything properly. Obviously, each floor represented a fragment of the jade. Once he understood everything, Ryu once more made his way to the 2nd floor. He followed along its long hallway. Though he could appear near the end instantly, he didn't want to miss any details that might be useful. Soon he reached the end, finding himself at large, golden double doors. Ryu could only sigh when he realized that the symbols that coded these doors were more artifacts from the White Devils. Would he really have to rely on the mental realm masters the people of his time hated so much to grow stronger in this life? It seemed fate was still playing tricks on him. Without much more thought, Ryu's mind pressed forward. The doors resisted slightly first, but as though Ryu had passed some sort of test of its, they swung open, basking Ryu in a blinding light his mind had to slowly adjust to. In that moment, Ryu found himself in a library so vast it shocked even him. For a man who spent much of his life in shrine library, one could imagine the scope of what was before him now. The bookshelves stretched several 100 meters high, and Ryu couldn't see the end of the length of them. It didn't take more than a quick glance for Ryu to realize that this wasn't a library of techniques. Rather, it was a hub of knowledge even more vast than the shrine library. A source of knowledge from the era of sky gods. Ryu grew excited once more. No one knew the benefit of knowledge more than he did. If it wasn't for shrine library, how could he ever have found a path to cultivate? Maybe someone else would be disappointed by this prospect, but Ryu found it wholly satisfying. Just as he was about to bring his mind out, planning on delving into this knowledge after completing his affairs on the higher mortal plane, Ryu realized that he had underestimated this 2nd floor. Images began to flash in his mind. It was confusing at first, but the purpose became clear soon after. 1st floor, cultivation. 2nd floor, core texts. 3rd floor, natural order. 4th floor, battle spirit. Ryu was completely wrong. All of this lost civilization's core teachings could be found right here. The flood of information hit Ryu like a tsunami. Numerous words and images appeared in his mind. At first it was bearable, but it very quickly became painful. It felt as though a guillotine had chosen his head as its target, splitting his very soul in half. Ryu suddenly understood what the test of this 2nd floor was. One wouldn't be allowed to gain recognition of this silver palace unless they had awoken their spiritual sense in the spiritual entrance realm. When this information streams into Ryu's mind, he felt both lucky and shocked. Lucky because he would have died had he not met this requirement, but shocked because such a requirement was far too stringent even by his standards. One had to know that spiritual sense wouldn't be birthed until the soul birth realm. Unlike Kai cultivation, which had 12 divisions, mental realm cultivation only had 6. Spiritual entrance, spiritual endowment, soul birth, soul refinement, soul ascension, and soul quintessence. Because there were so few divisions, every step was a massive watershed of its own. One had to know that, technically speaking, Ryu had been cultivating his mental realm for practically every moment since he was viciously beat by Patriarch Agnes. He was only 9 years old back then, but now he was already 16. It took him 7 years to reach this stage. One can see by this just how difficult mental realm cultivation was. Entering the soul birth realm was the equivalent of becoming a divine vessel realm expert. This meant that this hidden civilization's test was analogous to asking an awakening realm expert to accomplish something only a divine vessel realm expert could. The scariest part was that Ryu hadn't succeeded due to any sort of talent of his own. The only reason he managed to do this was because he had the origin flame, a treasure so valuable that it was almost impossible to even name something that was its match in value. Ryu could hardly finish his thoughts about how ridiculous the requirements were before his mind seemed to shatter, and everything went black. By the time he awoke again, he found himself sprawled at the bottom of the spiritual chi pool. Luckily, it was now empty. Rubbing his forehead, Ryu sat up. To think that just the information about the Silver Palace and its uses caused him to black out. What would happen if he wanted to learn something more useful? Wouldn't his mental realm collapse in on itself? Oh, once Ryu's mind cleared, he found a pleasant surprise. His mental realm had actually largened by a small bit. The amount was minuscule, barely a few centimeters, but this benefit couldn't be underestimated. Now his spiritual senses range was 30 meters and 3 centimeters. Ryu paused, trying to decide what to do. He was certain that the remaining 3 fragments were being held with the Viri, Lantes, and Tor kingdoms. But he also knew that this matter couldn't be so simple. If it was just a matter of wasting a few years to collect them, Ryu would do so in a heartbeat. But there were too many still lingering questions. Why was something so important left to these weak kingdoms? Why was it that the Opes kingdom never touched theirs, but the King Tor seemed to frequent his? This wasn't even what worried Ryu the most. The actions of the immortal from all those years ago was truly baffling. What reason did he or she have to come to this higher mortal plane? Could it be related? Ryu steeled himself and re-entered the crystalline jade. In just a moment, he had made his way back to the Silver Palace's library. Something he now knew was called the Zhu Palace, after the Zhu clan that built it all. Having a map of the area in his mind now, Ryu surged forward, or rather, his mind did. Because he only had to think to perform an action, he could have been able to reach his destination in an instant. But the Zhu library was so exaggeratedly large, it still took Ryu several minutes to reach its center. There, Ryu looked up to see a magnificent scene. Beautiful, wide, 4-sided silver stairs greeted him. At the very top sat 4 thrones, each facing its own cardinal direction. Atop these thrones sat 2 emperors and 2 empresses. The women were exaggeratedly beautiful, even a step above Ryu's own mother, a feat he thought was impossible. Their white hair shimmered with a golden hue, and their silver eyes pierced through the veil, a gentle smile resting upon their soft, pink lips. As for the men, they were several steps above Ryu in looks as well. They shared the same eye and hair color as the women, but their faces were stoic and lacking emotion. The pressure these 4 lifelike images placed on Ryu was unimaginable. Even just looking at them made Ryu feel as though his mind was being tested. Visualization technique. Ryu suddenly understood it all. The reason this crystalline jade had such a good effect on his mental realm was because it was entirely designed as a visualization technique. While body and chi realm cultivation had their own methods of improvement, so too did the mental realm. Ryu took such a long time to improve because he had no mental realm cultivation technique. Yet here, even the floors beneath his feet were cultivation techniques. Ryu's way of cultivating his mind in the past was the crudest form. He would place himself under pressure, then use his willpower to break through. However, visualization techniques streamlined this process and vastly improved its efficiency. The concept was simple. Visualize a difficult image. The more complex the image, and the more detailed your visualization, the stronger your mental realm became. Someone finally came here, but their mental realm talent is actually so weak. Fate seems to want to play tricks on our Zhu clan once more. Ryu was startled out of his thoughts, firstly because he hadn't expected one of the male statues to speak, and secondly because this was the first time in his life that he had been described as a weak talent. This was definitely a new feeling to him. Well, he met the basic requirement at least. Most couldn't even do that. Isn't it obvious? He was only able to do so thanks to external help. Your eyes are failing you. Plus, the pitiful thing actually called furniture a visualization technique. Isn't that too wretched? Kick him out. Ryu didn't have much of a reaction to these words. In fact, his expression was so calm that it partially startled the four Zhu ancestors. Normally, after hearing such words, there were one of two reactions. The first would be defensive. In this scenario, a person would be greatly offended and attempt to argue for themselves. As for the second, it would be one of fear. After all, these were ancestors of the sky god era. This was the undisputed strongest era of humans, only marginally matched by Ryu's golden era. How could one not fear these four? Don't be so mean to the handsome little brother, Balor. One of the empresses reprimanded. Do you think you have the right to be picky? You're dead. This empress voice sounded immature and childish. In fact, it gave one an inexplicable feeling of warmth. But such things only forced Ryu to put his guard up. He didn't believe that anyone who could rise to the top of such an ancient clan could be as naive and innocent as she pretended to be. If you keep talking in that disgusting voice, Flora, it'll shatter your incarnation jade, so I never have to listen to you again. I wonder how many men you've lured into your bed only to kill them with that fake sweetness. Balor responded in disgust. Flora seemed to make a pouting sound. We aren't toddlers, Balor. If you wanted me to invite you to my bed so eagerly, you should just use your words. What is with all of this petty jealousy? I am an empress. Why would I hold myself to just one husband? The men of my era were too weak to satisfy my needs alone. Maybe if you or Brother Morvar was alive in my time, I wouldn't have suffered so. Hearing such an innocent voice say such words could send a shiver down anyone's spine. Ryu was certain that this woman had blood that could drown the largest oceans on her hands. I don't invite whores to my bed, woman. Balor snorted. How sexist of you. You probably lost count of how many concubines you had in your lifetime. But I just wanted a few dozen husbands, and suddenly I'm a whore. Can you believe this narrow-minded meanie, handsome little brother? What do you think? You're a little too weak to be my husband, but I don't mind letting you spend a few nights with an empress. It would also help your cultivation greatly. What do you say? Flora's spirit floated out from an incarnation jade that hung from her statue's neck, gliding down to tease Ryu. I have a wife, no thank you. Ryu replied plainly. Balor's uproarious laughter filled Zhu library. I've changed my mind, I like this kid. Flora pouted. Her appearance was truly too adorable, nothing like the lofty empress her words painted herself out to be. You've certainly dodged a bullet, kid. Though your mental realm talent is trash, you have an ancestral great circle. If you agreed to her ask, not only would you not be able to taste her sweet peach, but you'd have your talent sucked away completely. This woman is too conniving. She pretends to be innocent on one hand, yet has killed more people than I could even dream of. On the other hand, she claims to be a champion in bed, but she is still a virgin. What a two-faced woman. HMPH. Flora harumphed, floating back up and disappearing into her incarnation jade. Who are you? Suddenly, a voice Ryu hadn't heard until now spoke. It was the other male. Morvar, Ryu believed Flora called him. I am Ryu Tatsuya. Ryu responded. You've taken the clan name of the ancient fire dragon. You have fire dragon blood running through your veins, and although you look like us, you have no connection to the Zhu clan at all. Though it is true that your talent is excellent even in our era, you would be useless trash if born in our Zhu clan. We care little for the body and chi realm paths. Giving the resources we ancestors have worked for to you would be a waste. You say all of this, yet you haven't killed me. Get to the point. Balor suddenly started laughing again. I like him, I really like him. He can see through your pile of shit from a mile away, Morvar. There goes your plan to act tough. Morvar didn't have much of a reaction to Ryu's words. He was a calm and straightforward person. While another individual would have found Ryu's response to be too abrasive, Morvar actually found it to be refreshing. As for Balor's goading, he never paid much attention to it anyway. The reason we haven't killed you yet is because we all recognize the rarity of the origin flame. Even an embryonic one like yours. It's not enough to close the gap between yourself and the peakmost geniuses of our Zhu clan, but it is enough to make you average. There's a second reason as well. I've sensed your mysteries of heaven and earth heavenly pupils. With these eyes, your comprehension abilities will be beyond normal logic. With it, you have an advantage mental realm talent cannot match in understanding and implementing visualization techniques. The combination of these two things make you comparable to an above-average talent in our Zoo clan. You would be worthy of being an outer fringe elder once you reach maturity. The problem is that this is not good enough. While you can comprehend and implement visualization techniques better than almost anyone else, your mental realm pool is too small, causing your stamina to be wholly lacking. In addition, your spiritual sense is only 30 meters in diameter after awakening. You don't qualify to learn even the weakest of techniques the four of us have access to. I don't mind if you give me nothing as long as I can use this library freely. Ryu responded. Oh, Morvar's brows perked up. Obviously, he hadn't expected such a response. I'll take him in first. Another voice Ryu had yet to hear spoke. It was kind and warm, filled with an air of maturity Flora didn't have. Eska, you mean too? Morvar asked in slight surprise. Hosh has always been a bookworm. Seems the little guy gained her favor. Balor chuckled. I'll teach him my immortal Sakura. His results will inform our final decision. Eska concluded. Ho ho, Flora giggled. I see that you like this handsome little brother very much, big sis Eska. I'll let you have him then. Eska didn't bother to respond to Flora. Instead, she too left her incarnation jade. She was truly the most beautiful woman Ryo had ever seen. In the beginning, Ryo had believed that the four Zoo ancestors were about equal in terms of looks, but it seemed he had sold Eska short, considering her throne was facing away from him. It was no wonder he had blindly made such an assumption. Even as an ethereal spirit, she carried a refined air that was impossible to match. Though it was easy for Ryu to imagine Flora as a heartless, vindictive woman, despite her innocent and adorable appearance, no matter how hard he tried to put his guard up against Eska, he found himself unwilling to taint her pure image. Still, Ryu was Ryu. Even though he was just like any other man who could enjoy looking at an absolute beauty, he also had too much control over himself to slip into a daze. As such, aside from a brief glint in his cold, silver eyes, he had no other reaction. How cold? Flora pouted. Is big sis Eska not good enough for you? That's enough, Flora, Eska said softly. Surprisingly, the talkative Flora immediately silenced herself. It became clear to Ryu that maybe these four ancestors weren't as equal as they appeared. Eska's eyes glistened as she slowly descended the steps. Her gait seemed to stretch time to infinity. At that moment, Ryu felt that he had only been able to shrug off her presence so easily because of how far away from him she had been initially. When experts die, usually that would be it. They would enter the cycle of reincarnation and hope that their accumulated karma provides them with good opportunities in their next life. However, those who have entered the soul birth realm and given the soul's form have another path they can take. These individuals, with the help of incarnation jades, are able to continue to exist in this plane and extend their lives near indefinitely. If proper circumstances are met, it's even possible for these individuals to revive. That said, incarnation jades aren't something you can simply pick up off the streets. Each piece is a valuable origin-grade mineral worth an astronomical sum. Yet, there were four of them here. What Ryu knew was that it was impossible for these four ancestors to be at the mere soul birth realm. His most favorable estimation was that they were all in the soul ascension realm. But something was telling him that this Eska, walking toward him slowly now, had long since entered soul quintessence. Simply put, even after so many epochs had passed since her death, she wouldn't even have to lift a single finger to kill him where he stood. Believe it or not, Eska continued in her soft tone, this legacy wasn't created to seek out inheritors or heirs to our teachings. You've seen the incarnation jades here, and I'm sure you understand what that means as a fellow scholar. Our goal has always been to revive the four of us. As such, whether or not you are a Zoo is irrelevant. In fact, having mental realm talent is immaterial. though useful. The only reason the possibility of you learning our techniques and benefiting from our zoo palace is on the table is to repay your help. In truth, the descendants of our zoo clan should have collected the necessary spiritual ingredients by now and stored them in our predetermined locations. However, with any plan that takes place over trillions of years, it's impossible to account for every wrinkle, which is likely why our zoo palace was found by you instead of one our own. If Eska knew that the protection of her clan's hopes was being left in the hands of such pitiful mortal plane kingdoms, just how would she react? What is your ultimate goal? Ryu asked. Eska stared at Ryu deeply for a moment. I founded the Zoo clan after the human race's war with the ancient beasts. With the establishment of our holy land, we officially ended the ancient beast era and ushered in the sky god era. However, the cycle of fate is unstoppable. Humans were never meant to usurp the ancient beasts. Ancient beasts themselves were the darlings of the heavens. Their talents were unmatched, their constitutions were perfect. They were the overlords of all of existence. Humans were a wrinkle that even the heavens couldn't calculate. Where we were lacking, we used our intelligence to make up for it. When the wall we faced was too high, we would find another path. When our goals seemed impossible, we would rely on hope. These were matters that neither the ancient beasts nor the heavens could comprehend. However, you must understand that the ancient beasts are fundamental to all of existence. Even if it takes several more eras, they will reappear once more. Ryu didn't buy this story even one bit. If Eska believed in humans so much, why did she have to revive? Shouldn't her belief in humanity have led her to a different conclusion? Plus, even if he chose to believe that this was Eska's purpose, could he really say the same for the other three? Still, Ryu had no power in this situation. He could only accept her words at face value. Eska watched Ryu silently, trying to gain a read on his thoughts. In the end, she chose to continue. What I will be teaching you is my magnus opus. Had I chosen to enter the cycle of reincarnation, the heavens would have recognized me as the immortal Sakura sky god. These words were thunder ringing in Ryu's ears. Eska was a sky god. Due to the fact she never entered the cycle of reincarnation, her second awakening legacy was never passed on. Ryu knew exactly what an immortal Sakura was. All this time, he had been speaking to these four ancestors in the ancient tongue of the sky gods. If translated to modern tongues, immortal Sakura directly translates to immortal cherry blossom. It was an ancient tree that went extinct long before Ryu was born. My immortal Sakura is a mental realm technique. Unlike body and chi realm techniques, its grade doesn't restrict what cultivation levels can use it. Instead, the levels of mastery within the technique itself are restricted by cultivation realm, meaning it can be used at all cultivation levels. I have never passed down my immortal Sakura, so it has no formal grade of its own. But what I can tell you is that it is an ultimate defensive technique, second to none. At its highest realm, even the wind itself cannot touch you without first asking. Ryu's eyes shone. What he was the most lacking in right now was defense. The best part was that, since this was a mental realm technique, there was no need for him to worry about its compatibility with his body. If the zoo library alone made his more than half-year of efforts worth it, this immortal Sakura could be counted as a pleasant surprise. Mental realm techniques are split into three stages: visualization, manipulation, and manifestation. The basis of a mental realm technique is its visualization. One must not only picture the technique in their mind, but it is necessary to understand its complexities. Manipulation is the next important step. In the case for an immortal Sakura that once had many iterations of itself birthed into existence, this is especially important. Obviously, no two immortal trees are identical. This tests a cultivator's ability to change the form of their visualization while keeping the core essence of the image. In the case of an ancient tree, this would be related to changing the number of branches or leaves, yet maintaining the technique's integrity. Finally, there is manifestation, Of the 3 steps, this is by far the most difficult. This requires a cultivator to project their visualization into the outside world, thereby causing changes within it. In the case of my immortal Sakura technique, the key to its defense are the falling blossoms from its branches. If these blossoms aren't manifested, then there is no technique. If your visualization falters in combat, then an attack you believed you had blocked could very well kill you. Ryu nodded. He knew too little about cultivation. This was especially so for mental realm cultivation that was banned during his first life. So this was very important knowledge for him. The reason I never passed down my immortal Sakura wasn't because I didn't want to, but because it led too many youths down a path of destruction. Mental realm cultivators, more than anyone else, are highly susceptible to cultivation deviation. There are no shortage of tales of visualizations, killing the cultivators who imagined them. In the case of my immortal Sakura, this is even more glaring. The immortal Sakura itself is an immortal spiritual plant. In fact, it was among the very few that gained sentience for itself. The difficulty in visualizing such an ancient incarnation is unfeasible for many. In truth, I am taking a risk by teaching you this technique. We do not know much about the heavenly pupils, since they had only just begun to be birthed during our sky god era. However, if I understand correctly, your pupils are particularly good at comprehending the quintessence of things. As such, I believe you may be among the few capable of leaping over this first hurdle. These things are all I can tell you for now. Are you willing to take the risk? Though Ryu remained calm, he was inwardly sighing a breath of relief. It was just as he expected. Heavenly pupils didn't exist in the chaos, primordial, and ancient beast eras. They didn't begin to appear until the sky god era. But it took time for those born with heavenly pupils to understand the gift they had been given. And it wasn't until the shrine era that any sort of proper ranking was created. This meant one thing. These 4 ancestors didn't understand the value of his heavenly pupils. It was no wonder their reactions were so nonchalant. His eyes were too novel when they first appeared back then. In fact, the mysteries of heaven and earth pupils weren't even ranked in the top 20 in their era. Ryu simply didn't trust these 4 ancestors. If they realized the value of his body, he would have one more thing to worry about. But luckily they didn't. Yes, Ryu replied without hesitation. Good. Since you haven't collected all 4 fragments, you cannot enter the natural order floor, and will thus have to settle for the barest bones version of my technique. However, you must remember that what makes my immortal Sakura so powerful is its endless flexibility. You must comprehend for yourself what sort of style benefits you the most. For now, watch and observe. I will show you the first of my technique's 7 stages. Behold, immortal Sakura. In that moment, Ryu couldn't take his eyes off of the scene before him. He never thought a tree could be so beautiful. He was completely mesmerized. The immortal Sakura that appeared above Eska's head was unlike other trees. Its trunk was incredibly short, only standing at about 2 meters before branching outward in what seemed like endless forking branches. The phenomena made the immortal Sakura far wider than it was tall. This wasn't all either. The branches formed a gorgeous dome. It wasn't the branches themselves that made the immortal Sakura so appealing, but rather the innumerable translucent blossoms that peppered its body. It was almost more of a semi-sphere of shimmering lights than a tree. Suddenly, the scene became even more spectacular. The blossoms began to fall one by one, their translucent bodies gently wafting through the air. It was a mesmerizing scene akin to a year's first snowfall. Pure and simple, but nature at its absolute finest. Immortal Sakura. My spiritual sense has long since reached a range capable of blanketing an entire plane. As such, the theoretical range of my immortal Sakura is equally as large. For you, who have yet to step upon even the first stage, it's impossible to maximize your immortal Sakura manifestation. In addition, your mental realm talent isn't as great as mine. Your range will never be so large. You must take it one step at a time. This is known as the translucent stage. It is followed by the white stage, the cherry, then red, violet, purple, gold, and finally, the gold stage. At the peak realm, even a sky god's attack can be casually deflected. The four ancestors truly underestimated Ryu's heavenly pupils far too much. It took Ryu all of a few seconds to perfectly grasp the quintessence of the first stage. He could already begin to prepare for his visualization stage. However, he purposely stretched the matter out, asking Eska endless questions. As time passed, the ancestors began to believe the heavenly pupils weren't a big deal after all. After 2 months, Ryu extracted his mind from the crystalline jade, a faint smile on his cold, handsome features. The ancestors were bound to never leave the zoo library due to the range limitations of the incarnation jade. They would never know what was happening outside, so he could rest easy. Ryu left Opes Kingdom, traveling to Viri Kingdoms. After another half-year, he left to Lantes Kingdom. Finally, not long after Ryu turned 17, he turned his sights to Tor Kingdom. It was time to complete Granny Miriam's revenge. Tor Kingdom had once been a mighty kingdom that stood above all others. Nothing could stop their progress. It was as though each passing generation only got better. Finally, 4 talents the likes of which were rare throughout history were born. First, Prince Amori and his unmatched intelligence. Second, Prince Wydrek and his business savvy. Third, Prince Kaden and his rare cultivation talent. And finally, fourth, Prince Ryu and his heaven-defying existence. Seeing such royalty leading them, the citizens of Tor were filled with an unbridled pride. It wasn't rare to see them looking down and snubbing their nose toward the other 3 kingdoms. They had a national pride that was hard to find, a pride that was solidified by the co-kingdom coronation games. However, everything had seemingly started to go downhill since then. Just months after Ryu was titled the Crown Prince, causing a wave of excitement, an undercurrent swept through the capital city. Important officials began to be murdered one after another, shaking public confidence in the royal clan ability to protect their own. Soon afterward, rumors began to float wantonly about the Crown Prince. Many began to speak about how it was impossible for him to be a Tor, and many others started to link his appearance to the evil white devils of years past. Why was it that a talent like Ryu was hidden from them for so long? Why was a talent like Ryu whipped in the streets of their capital city? Why was it that Ryu's mother was demoted from first concubine to third, despite having given birth to such a talent? Doubt began to permeate the once unblemished Tor Kingdom. However, national pride was strong. After many centuries, it was difficult to shake the loyalists. However, that was when another bomb was dropped upon the citizens. Everyone knew that King Tor's eldest children weren't his sons, but rather his 2 daughters. In their youth, these 2 women were the flowers of the capital, filling them with life and joy. However, there was a very obvious question everyone seemed to ignore until now. Why was it that Olivia was queen and not the mother of Princess Isla and Dahlia, second concubine Celine? Many dismissed this. After all, everyone also knew that second concubine Celine was bedridden. How could such a sick woman be fit to be queen? It only made sense that Olivia took up that role. But there wasn't enough time for this belief to become consensus before rumors of treachery began to surface. According to the rumors, second concubine Celine was meant to become queen. In fact, King Tor loved her even more than his former favorite concubine, and Ryu's mother, Leilani. However, the Heir clan made a move to cripple her, forcing her into an indefinite coma she had yet to awaken from. Who was second concubine Celine, one might ask? She was none other than the elder sister of first concubine Catalina and Wydrek's aunt. That was right, Celine was a member of the Garis clan. When this clicked for everyone, they couldn't help but remember back to a matter the imperial censors buried more than 2 decades ago. Back then, the Garis clan had kicked up a fuss, wanting justice for their eldest mistress, but nothing came out of it. Until now. And the culprit of all of this. Shocking revelations revealed that it was none other than the first-ranked noble clan of their kingdom, the Heir clan. Once these matters were revealed, tensions skyrocketed. The Heir clan, who had already been under a lot of pressure after Ryu was named crown prince, was forced to take action. Initially, the Tor clan and King Tor planned to squash the matter as they had before, but the Garis clan was having none of it. In the end, the Heir clan made their move. This was when the matters of the assassinated officials bore fruit. All who remained among the ministers were loyalists the Heir clan had personally fostered. Imperial censor Briggs led the charge, proceeding to make multiple public statements denouncing the actions of the Tor clan in hiding these matters. The public sympathized with the censor. He, at risk to his own life, didn't hesitate to continue to fulfill his duty and uphold the moral code of Tor Kingdom. Unfortunately, these matters split the kingdom in half. Some felt that these matters could still be resolved, while others were calling for King Tor to abdicate and allow Prince Ryu to ascend to the throne. However, no one could have guessed what happened next. Imperial censor Briggs actually called for Patriarch Heir to ascend to the throne instead. An uproar washed over Tor Kingdom. Even if they sympathized with the plight of the Garis clan, wasn't it the Heir clan who was responsible for those matters in the first place? Where was the logic in calling for them to take control of the throne? Patriarch Heir had never expected for such long-forgotten rumors to suddenly resurface, so he had no choice but to accelerate his plans. With more than 90% of the ministers on his side, he could shape public perception as he saw fit. He had the ministers correct the rumors floating around. According to the news story, it wasn't the Heir clan who made a move on Saline, but Ryu's Agnes clan. It was obvious who the public would choose to believe. Why trust randomly started rumors instead of the ministers? They put their lives in the hands of. The Agnes clan stood not a single chance. Patriarch Agnes and his whole lineage were publicly executed. In the end, the only surviving member was third concubine Leilani, who was spared due to her position within the imperial harem, though she was put under house arrest. By this point, King Tor was completely enraged. The sparks of war were set off, and the first civil war of Tor Kingdom began, splitting the remaining noble clans in half. The Kunal and Manhwa clans sided with the Tor clan, while the Remes and Garis clans sided with Heir clan. How could the Garis not want revenge for what the Tor clan had allowed to happen to them? However, who would have known that just 2 months into the battle, the Garis clan would flip on the Heir clan? In what was the decisive battle, the Garis clan revealed that it knew all along that the Heir clan was responsible for their humiliation. The flip caught Patriarch Heir completely off guard. What remained of the Dragon Corps were completely routed, and the Heir clan and their ambitions were burnt to the ground. Rumors had it that during his final day, a melancholy laugh left Patriarch Heir's lips as he stood on the rooftop of their clan hall. Then he committed suicide, falling into a pit of fire below. It seemed that everything had come to a conclusion at that point. The Tor clan reaffirmed their position as ruler, and the Garis clan became the #1 noble clan under their rule. But who could have expected that not even half a month after their battle concluded, that the Land Tess, Viri, and Opes kingdoms would all march on Tor Kingdom?